just 2 months before the start of the Olympics. And of course, they're going to be used by athletes, and it's gross in there.
They're going to swim in the Seine?
That's what they're doing.
The triathlon thing. That's going to be... Tom Keene, this is the #1 story for Tom Keene. He follows this religiously. And you have to put him somewhere, don't you?
Yeah.
All these people.
I would have to drink a lot of beer before
Hudson?
jumping in that river.
I mean, if we did the Olympics here in the summer, wouldn't we have to do something like that in the Hudson?
I would think so. I mean,
yeah, where else are you going to do it?
Taking down the Jersey Shore.
In a pool.
In a pool. It'd take a while.
Hundreds of these people running all over the place.
Apparently, it's E. coli. So the latest results showed levels of E. coli and enterococci.
Oh, that's not good.
I mean, that sounds bad.
E. coli is what comes out of your... It's raw sewage.
Okay, well, there you go. And it's higher than the authorized limits. Apparently, some of it's okay. But for sports federations and European bathing standards, it is not okay.
Didn't they have this problem in Rio? Did I remember that right?
Oh, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know, but you got to put them somewhere.
But legit, what are you going to do?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, you can't clean up that natural body of water in a short period of time. I wouldn't think.
Is Notre Dame the cathedral? Is it finished now?
No, it's not.
Okay,
but they're working on it. Apparently, France has spent 1.4 billion euros upgrading the sewage treatment and stormwater facilities around Paris to reduce the amount of untreated fecal matter flowing into the river. Awesome sauce.
That is
brutal. That sounds great.
But okay, that aside, this has the makings of being one of the most spectacular Olympics of all time. Olympics in Paris in the summer.
Are you going?
No, but
it
just feels like it feels like somebody needs to send me there.
Is she really? Oh wait, no, but she's not going for the Olympics, is she? This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, folks, this is what we're doing here in this hour. Former President Donald Trump is scheduled to hold a news conference at 11 a.m. from, I believe, Trump Tower, a day after he was found guilty on 34 felony offenses. So when he comes and speaks, we will bring that to you live. I think before that, let's check in, Alex, with Joe Matthew. He is co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power to get his thoughts here. Joe, anything could happen here today. Gag order, no gag order. We're not really sure what to expect here. What do you and your sources down in Washington expect to hear today?
Well, look, I think that you've probably heard this speech before. It's being dubbed a press conference by the former president. I don't know if he's planning to take a lot of questions. This is typically a conversation that's preceded by a stem-winding speech that reminds us of all the folks who have wronged him. You're looking at a live view now, if you're with us on YouTube, of the podium that's set up here at Trump Tower, countless flags behind him. But it just feels different this morning, Paul. I mean, imagine what he thought when he woke up this morning as a convicted felon. And we've seen a remarkable coalescing of Republicans behind him since the verdict. And I'll tell you guys something. We just got numbers a short time ago on fundraising, knowing that Donald Trump put out a fundraising plea within minutes of the guilty verdict last night, calling himself a political prisoner. $34.8 million in small dollar online contributions off the conviction alone. That's about double his previous record haul in this campaign, which says a lot about where we are in American politics.
I mean, it definitely does. Which raises the question, what impact does this actually have at all? What is the percentage of independents or swing voters that would have changed their vote depending on what the conviction actually was?
It's really hard for anybody, I think, to answer that honestly. In our own polling, we've seen numbers suggesting that a conviction, but more so incarceration, might be a game changer or a mind changer for independents. But the fact of the matter is, it's a moneymaker right now, and we have 6 months to an election where it's very difficult to tell how popular sentiment might move around this. We'll have a debate. We'll have a convention. People are going to see him be sentenced. Guys, he's going to have a meeting with his probation officer between now and July 11th. All of these things can slowly turn public perception in a way that we just can't predict today.
You know, it kind of makes me wonder why we don't do it the way England does it. They just have an election, they call it, and a couple weeks later they had the election.
Yes.
Joe, you just reminded us 6 months to our...
And the day that they do the election, you can't talk about it.
Perfect.
Or else you get fined.
Even better.
Oh, my God.
Even better. All right, so, Joe, from Washington, D.C., members of Congress, what's been kind of the public statements we've been hearing?
The reaction was immediate. Like I said, it was within, I think, 20 minutes of the verdict that the Speaker of the House himself had a statement out. Mike Johnson talked about shameful charges, a shameful day in American history, an absurd verdict. Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, who of course has been said to be on the short list for vice president, tweeted in a fundraising link, "Don't just get angry about this travesty, get even." And there is a sense of retribution in the air. When lawmakers come back next week, you're going to see Jim Jordan on the Judiciary Committee and Jim Comer on the Oversight Committee bear down on this. Expect hearings, expect investigations into Juan Marchand, into Alvin Bragg, the DA. All of this has been threatened and will likely be coming as soon as they get back to town.
Oh, boy. What else do we know from politicians' reactions? You know, first of all, I thought you guys did a great job yesterday breaking the news and having all of these angles, and Tyler did a great job of kind of summing up what some people in the House and also the Senate were saying in their support. Where does this put Republicans? Because Terry Haynes was talking last night that potentially this doesn't give them any cover. Like, President Trump was already struggling with moderates, and how does this help him in that case?
Well, I think to suggest that this helps the former president being a convicted felon is a bit of a stretch. It's a moneymaker right now. He might even get a couple of points out of this in the polls, thanks to the sort of martyrdom impact, that first salvo we saw from him on Truth Social, which was clearly made before the verdict. He called himself a political prisoner. You see a picture of him there with his fist up in the air. That's how they're going to try to frame this, almost as if he was one of the January 6 rioters, who he now refers to as hostages. There's a picture of it for folks with us on YouTube now. So I don't know exactly how to answer that in without being in kind of a day-by-day situation, because it's going to feel different in August. It's going to feel different in September than it does today.
So it's interesting, Joe. I mean, I think one of the issues is how hard does the Biden campaign go after this, or do they stay a little bit on the sidelines and just let things play out?
Great question.
Oh, here we go.
We saw them break their own rules this week,
Joe,
Paul. Looks like Donald Trump is at the podium.
Up to, he's standing right in front of the podium. So let's go right now to Trump Tower in New York City for former President Donald Trump.
These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people. When you look at our country, what's happening, where millions and millions of people are flowing in from all parts of the world, not just South America, from Africa, from Asia, from the Middle East, and they're coming in from jails and prisons, and they're coming in from mental institutions and insane asylums. They're coming in from all over the world into our country. And we have a president and a group of fascists that don't want to do anything about it, because they could right now, today, he could stop it. But he's not. They're destroying our country. Our country is in very bad shape. And they're very much against me saying these things. They want to raise your taxes by 4 times. They want to stop you from having cars with their ridiculous mandates that make it impossible for you to get a car or afford a car. It would make it very possible for China to build all of our cars. It's a very serious problem that we have. We just went through one of many experiences where we had a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. There's never been a more conflicted judge. Now, I'm under a gag order, which nobody's ever been under. No presidential candidate's ever been under a gag order before. I'm under a gag order, nasty gag order, where I've had to pay thousands of dollars in penalties and fines and was threatened with jail. Think of it. I'm the leading candidate. I'm leading Biden by a lot, and I'm leading the Republicans to the point where that's over. So I'm the leading person for president, and I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put two sentences together, given by a court, and they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, just so you understand. This is all done by Biden and his people. And maybe his people more importantly. I don't know if Biden knows too much about it, because I don't know if he knows about anything. But he's nevertheless the president, so we have to use his name. And this is done by Washington, and nobody's ever seen anything like it. So we have a judge who's highly conflicted. You know what the confliction is. Nobody wants to write about it, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. If I do, he said, I get put in jail. So we'll play that game a little bit longer. We won't talk about it, but you're allowed to talk about it. I hope you do, because there's never been anybody so conflicted as this. As far as the trial itself, it was very unfair. We weren't allowed to use our election expert under any circumstances. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified by this man who looks like an angel, but he's really a devil. He looks so nice and soft. People say, oh, he seems like such a nice man. No, unless you saw him in action. And you saw that with a certain witness that went through hell. And when we wanted to do things, he wouldn't let us do those things. But when the government wanted something, they got everything. They got everything they wanted. It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted. And obviously he didn't do that. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. We had a DA who was a failed DA. Crime is rampant in New York, violent crime. That's what he's really supposed to be looking at. Crime is rampant in New York. Yesterday in McDonald's, you had a man hitting him up with machetes, a machete. Whoever can imagine even a machete being wielded in a store, in a place where they're eating, and he's going rampant, and Bragg is down watching a trial on what they call crimes. They're falsifying business records. That sounds so bad. To me, it sounds very bad. You know, it's only a misdemeanor, but to me, it sounds so bad. When they say falsifying business, that's a bad thing for me. I've never had that before. I'm falsifying. You know what falsifying business records is? In the first degree. They say falsifying business records. Sounds so good, right? It means that legal expense. I paid a lawyer, totally legal. I paid a lawyer a legal expense. And a bookkeeper, without any knowledge from me, correctly marked it down in the books. A very professional woman, highly respected, she testified. Marked it down in the books as a legal expense. So a legal expense, paid a lawyer, is a legal expense in the books. It's not sheetrock, construction, or any other thing. It's a legal expense. Think of that. This is what the falsification of business records were. And I said, what else are you going to call it? What else are you going to call it? Now, I would have testified. I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify, because as soon as you testify, anybody, if it were George Washington, don't testify, because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong, and then they sue you for perjury. But I didn't care about that. I wanted to. But the judge allowed them to go into everything that I was ever involved in, not this case, everything that I was ever involved in, which is a first. In other words, you could go into every single thing that I ever did. Was he a bad boy here? Was he a bad boy there? And my lawyer said, what do you need to go through? And all you wanted to do is testify simply on this case. Because I would have loved to have testified. To this day, I would have liked to have testified. But you would have said something out of whack, like it was a beautiful sunny day and it was actually raining out. And I very much appreciate the big crowd of people outside. That's incredible what's happening. The level of support has been incredible. So the whole thing is legal expense was marked down as legal expense. Think of it. This is the crime that I committed. that I'm supposed to go to jail for 187 years for. When you have violent crime all over this city at levels that nobody's ever seen before, where you have businesses leaving, and businesses are leaving because of this, because heads of businesses say, man, we don't want to get involved with that. I could go through the books of any business person in this city, and I could find things that in theory, I guess, let's indict him, let's destroy his life. But I'm out there, and I don't mind being out there because I'm doing something for this country, and I'm doing something for our Constitution. It's very important, far beyond me. And this can't be allowed to happen to other presidents. It should never be allowed to happen in the future. But this is far beyond me. This is bigger than Trump. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than my presidency. And the people understand it because I just see a poll just came out, the Daily Mail. That was the first one, came out, was done last night right after the verdict, where I'm up 6 points. 6 points from what we already were. We were leading fairly substantially. We're up 6 points in the Daily Mail poll. Now, maybe other polls come out and it says something differently, but a lot of people have predicted it because the public understands and they understand what's going on. This is a scam. There's a rigged trial. It shouldn't have been in that venue. We shouldn't have had that judge. He should have allowed us to have an election expert. We had the best expert, most respected expert, head of the Federal Elections Commission. He was all set to testify. He was waiting for 2 days. And when it was his turn, Bragg's people protested. And the judge knocked him out, said, you can't testify. He actually said, you can't testify for anything having to do with the trial. You can say what the federal elections is. Well, that doesn't help. Everybody knows that. But you can't testify. So essentially, he wasn't able to testify. Other people weren't able to testify. But with these people, they were able to use people salacious. By the way, and nothing ever happened. There was no anything. Nothing ever happened, and they know it. But they were as salacious as they could be, and it had nothing to do with the case, but it had to do with politics. And do you notice the timing? The timing was perfect. This case was dead. It was dropped by every agency, every governmental board. It was dropped by the highly respected Southern District. They said, no, there's no case here. It was dropped by federal election, and that's what it's about. This is about a federal election, not a state election. You're not even allowed to look at it. They took the state and the city, and they went into a federal election. They're not allowed. The people from federal election, Southern District, and Washington dropped the case. Everybody dropped the case. There was no case. Cy Vance dropped the case. And when Bragg came in, he said, this is the most ridiculous case I've ever seen. And who would have a certain person, again, gag order, who would have a certain person like this ever testify? He said, this is essentially one of the worst people I've ever seen, ever, to testify. He said, the craziest case I've ever seen. This is Bragg. Then when I announced I was running for president, a long time later, they decided to revive this case. And they got a judge, Judge Marchand, who was responsible for another case that was also brought. It destroyed the life of a very good man, by the way. Destroyed the life of a very good man who went to prison once, and then they just put him in prison again because they said he lied. He didn't lie. I looked at the statements he made. In fact, he didn't remember something, and they put him in jail. Again, they've destroyed him. With me for many years, he was an honorable person. He was an honest man. And if you look at what he did, supposedly, it never happened. There's never been anything like this. Over the education of his grandchildren. Over, he didn't report that he had a car or 2 cars on his income. I don't know. I wonder how many people here have cars. I wonder how many people said, oh, gee, I have a car that's worth X dollars. How do you even figure it? And I guess you do have to report it, but I would say probably almost nobody does. Nobody even thinks about it. They put this man, they destroyed this man, but they put him in jail again because they didn't want him to testify. They didn't want him to testify. That's why he went to jail. They put him in jail twice. He's 77 years old. Now, normally I'd say that's an old guy, but I don't feel 77. Nobody ever says that about me. I'd like them to say, gee, we have to have a little sorrow for this man, because they just don't say that about me. But maybe I'm better off that way. I think I'm probably better off that way. But they put him in jail twice. And you have to see what they put him in jail. And he was threatened by the judge. This man was told, you're going to get 15 years in jail if you don't give up Trump. And he was told that. You're going to get 15 years in jail. And he made a plea deal because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life. And he was told that viciously. We're living in a fascist state. He was told that viciously. So you can go to jail for 4 months, 5 months, or you can get 15 years in jail. So do a plea. Almost who wouldn't do that plea? Everyone does those pleas. It's a horrible thing. There's a whole group of lawyers that fight that. It's so unfair. It's so unfair. But they destroyed his life. So many other things. You look at Southern District didn't want to bring the case. Nobody wanted to bring the case. And then you know who didn't want to bring the case? Most of all is Bragg. Bragg didn't want to bring it. But then he brought it. And they tried to make it a different case. They didn't say legal expense equal legal expense. Again, if I wrote down and paid a lawyer, and by the way, this was a highly qualified lawyer. Now, I'm not allowed to use his name because of the gag order. But you know, he's a sleazebag. Everybody knows that. Took me a while to find out. But he was effective. He did work. But he wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. You know, they like to use the word fixer. He wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. At the time, he was a fully accredited lawyer. Now, he got into trouble not because of me. He got into trouble because he made outside deals, and he had something to do with taxi cabs and medallions, and he borrowed money. And that's why he went. And then he pled to three election violations. And as soon as I saw that, I said, I wonder why he did that. He pled. He took a deal. Now, he took a deal because he wanted to get off. In other words, I'll take a plea deal and I want to get off. And he wanted to make a deal with the Southern District. And they wrote the worst report I think I've ever seen on any human being, other than the report that was written on James Comey by the Inspector General, a very great Inspector General, actually, wrote a report that was so bad. This one was possibly worse. The Southern District, the judge didn't let us use it. He said, it's hearsay. I said, it's not hearsay. Wouldn't let us use it. This is about the man. But he got in trouble for a very simple reason, because he was involved with borrowing a lot of money, and he did something with the banks. I don't know if it's defrauded the banks, but something happened. You guys know what it is. And then in addition to that, he gave up on 3 things where he wasn't guilty. In fact, they were going to testify in that. The head of the FEC, the Brad Smith, the election expert, #1 rated in the country, who was going to testify. He took a plea on 3 things. He just added them in because that gave him more bargaining power with respect to me. But the 3 things that he pled on, having to do with the election and having to do essentially a little bit with me, they weren't crimes. They weren't crimes. Nor is paying money under an NDA. So we have an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. It's a big deal, a non-disclosure agreement. Totally honorable, totally good, totally accepted. Everybody has them. Every company has non-disclosure agreements. But the press called it slush fund and all sorts of other things. Hush money, hush money. It's not hush money. It's called a non-disclosure agreement. And most of the people in this room have a non-disclosure agreement with their company. It's a disgrace. So it's not hush money. It's a non-disclosure agreement, totally legal, totally common. Everyone has it. And what happened is he signed a non-disclosure agreement with this person, I guess other people, but it's totally honest. You're allowed to make the payment. You don't have to make it. You can make it any way you want. It's a non-disclosure agreement. And he signed that. And there was nothing wrong with signing it. And this should have been a non-case. And everybody said it was a non-case, including Bragg. Bragg said, until I ran for office. And then they saw the polls. I was leading the Republicans. I was leading the Democrats. I was leading everybody. And all of a sudden, they brought it back. It's a very sad thing that's happening in our country. And it's a thing that I'm honored. In a way, I'm honored. It's not that it's pleasant. It's very bad for family. It's very bad for friends and businesses. But I'm honored to be involved in it because somebody has to do it. And I might as well keep going and be the one. But I'm very honored to be involved because we're fighting for our Constitution. The money that was paid legally. There was nothing illegal. In fact, the lawyer in creating the NDA, because at that time he was a fully accredited lawyer. He wasn't a fixer. I never thought of him as a fixer. The media called him a fixer, or the prosecutors called him a fixer. He was a lawyer, and he was fairly good. Later on, I didn't like what he did. I didn't like, for instance, I didn't like that when I became president, he went around and made deals with companies. When I heard that, he was gone. He was gone. And he had payments coming to him, and a lot of this involved things that are very simple. There was nothing wrong. This was standard stuff, all standard stuff. Everything involved was standard. There was no crime here. In fact, I just watched a couple of the reports. You watched Jonathan Turley, Andy McCarthy, Greg Jarrett. You look at all of these people, Mark Levin, all very talented people, great people, many more. And they don't know me, essentially. They don't know me. They're legal scholars and experts. But I look at them. I watched Turley this morning saying, there's no crime here. Everybody says there's no crime here, except for this DA that's got the city out of control with crime. It's absolutely out of control. So we have an NDA that was signed. We have legal expenses. And here's the thing, on legal expenses, you have 100 where they say, they do a charge. I just recorded this out. Falsification of business records in the first degree. It sounds so bad. I said, wow. And even my own lawyers, I get very upset with them because they don't say what it is. They say, well, falsification of legal records is only a felony. Well, that's a lot. Is only they say a misdemeanor. But they try and bring it up to a felony if there's 2 crimes. They have all these different things. The other thing is they missed the statute of limitations by a lot because this was very old. They could have brought this 7 years ago instead of bringing it right in the middle of the election. So they missed the statute of limitations. They did everything. Now, let me give you the good news. The good news is last night, we just got a report this morning, in the history of politics, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody will find that I'm wrong, maybe, but I don't think so. They raised with small money donors, meaning like $21, $42, $53, $38, a record $39 million in about a 10-hour period. No, think of that. I like those people. Because so far, I guess it's backfiring. Now, I don't know. I'd rather not have it happen. I don't want to have it backfiring. I don't want to win this thing legitimately, not because they were stupid and did things that they shouldn't be doing. They shouldn't have brought this case. They were saying it this morning. This is a case that should not have been brought. I watched Andy McCarthy say this is a case that should not have been brought. And that was this morning. But they all say that. Every legal scholar has said it. And these are great people. They really understand the law. The other thing, a poll just came out. The first poll, I don't know, maybe others will be bad. But a poll just came out a little while ago. The Daily Mail. Does anybody read the Daily Mail? It's very good. They have a good poll. At least I like it today. And the Daily Mail just came out with a poll, and it has Trump up 6 points in the last 12 hours, 6 points. 6 points since this happened. Who thought this could happen? Because the people of our country know it's a hoax. They know it's a hoax. They get it. You know, they're really smart, and it's really something. So we're going to be appealing this scam. We're going to be appealing it on many different things. He wouldn't allow us to have witnesses. He wouldn't allow us to talk. He wouldn't allow us to do anything. The judge was a tyrant. And you got to see that with Bob Costello, a fine man. I've never seen anything like it, and neither has anybody that was in that courthouse where he demanded that the courthouse be cleared. Now, the good news is most of the people in the courthouse were the media. And anybody that was in the media, if you're fair, you'll say, wow, that was anger. That was crazed. He was crazed. And the reason that Bob Costello acted a little bit upset, which I think he has a right to, was that every question he was being asked was being objected to by the other side and sustained by the judge. Sustained, sustained, sustained. I think he did it many times. I don't know what the number, many times. Even I was sitting there saying, and these were basic questions. And I never saw anybody treated that way by a judge. And I've been treated very badly by 2 other judges also, because it's all the same thing. And it all comes out of the White House. Crooked Joe Biden, the worst president in the history of our country. He's the worst president in the history of our country. The most incompetent. He's the dumbest president we've ever had. He's the dumbest president, most incompetent president, and he's the most dishonest president we've ever had. And so many of he's a Manchurian candidate. You take a look at the way he treats China, Russia, so many others. You know, I ended the Russian pipeline. It was dead. He comes in and he approves it. And he gets $3.5 million, meaning $3.5 million is paid to the family, his family, from the mayor of Moscow's wife. And I said, where did that come from? Nobody wants to talk about it. But he's a very big danger to our country. And the only way they think they can win this election is by doing exactly what they're doing right now, win it in the courts because they can't win it at the ballot box. So we're going to show them that, we're going to fight. It's actually, I don't know, it's something where I'm wired in such a way that a lot of people would have gone away a long time ago. They would have gone away after impeachment hoax #1. That was a total hoax. I had great support from the Republican Party, though. Then you had impeachment hoax #2. And then they formed the committee. How about they formed the committee of thugs, the J6 committee of thugs. And they took their records and they destroyed all of the records after the committee was abandoned because those records were great for us. Now, can you imagine if Republicans did that? Everybody would have been in jail by now. Think of it, the unselect, I call it the unselect, they call it select committee, I call it the unselect committee of thugs. They meet, it's 100% Democrat and 2 past Republicans that are no longer Republicans, that are no longer in business anymore, thank you. But it was all Democrats and 2 wayward Republicans. Liz Cheney and crying Adam Kinzinger. He cries every time he goes on television. He's the most emotional human being I think I've ever seen. And that was our representatives. These 2 people were our rep. So they had all this stuff that they're leaking. And then when it came time to look at the records, like where the police said and the Capitol Guard said that I supplied, think of it, that I recommended as many soldiers or National Guard as you want. 10,000. If you had 500, you wouldn't have had a problem. There wouldn't have been a J6. But Nancy Pelosi and the group didn't want it. Anyway, so they have testimony to all of that, that I did not attack the Secret Service agent in the front of a car. You know, these are strong people. And I supposedly went to the driver, and I grabbed him around the neck. And he rebuffed me, and then I went to the other guy, who I think is a black belt in karate, and he's slightly younger than me. Maybe
all right, that was,
years.
we're listening to former President Donald Trump speaking at Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan, press conference in response to the being found guilty of
For 34 counts,
34
yep.
counts of felony. So again, some of the typical response I guess we would expect. He's calling this a sham and kind of being railroaded. So not certainly supporting what is going on. Let's go to Joe Matthew right here. He's co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power. Joe, I guess nothing new in the comments from former President Trump. What are your thoughts here?
No, this is pretty much rehash of the stump speech, to be honest, although he's going deep now all the way back to January 6th, whether he attacked the Secret Service in the car. He started with the border, which was interesting. Of course, this was billed as a press conference on his conviction yesterday. He's still in over a half an hour, has not taken one question. He's just going off the cuff on a list of grievances. The one thing I'll point out here, you can fact check this stuff all day long, is that when he gets into, as he said, quote, this is all done by Biden and his people, this is done by Washington. This is a state case. You guys are sitting in New York, and it actually has no direct connection to the administration or Washington.
Meaning that it's a, right, yes, understood. So what else really stands out, though, in terms of what we can then expect on that campaign trail as we go forward, and this is being used as a political pinball within that?
Well, I think we've seen it already. Political prisoner is how he's billing himself. Retribution tour is how the campaign began. And look, if this comes down to a jailhouse call into the Republican convention in Milwaukee, and we don't know if that's going to be the case or not, he will probably find a way to spin that to his advantage. I mean, look, he's been selling mugshot T-shirts for months and months now, making money on it. So this is someone who, as we see here in the process, is making people laugh the way that he's making fun of Joe Biden. But the questions that we have are about the long-term corrosive impact that this could have, particularly on independent voters, suburban women, and folks who are looking now at a convicted felon. And we'll see what happens after he meets with his probation officer and is eventually sentenced.
So, Joe, I guess you raised the political question, is what the impact will be on, I guess, just folks that are not in either camp, some of those moderates, the people in the middle. Have we seen any polling on that, Joe?
We have, and some of it is right here at Bloomberg. We were asking in January in our Bloomberg swing state poll what a conviction would do, or an incarceration, and we did find within single digits the number of folks who said that they in fact would change their vote on that. But it's different when it's hypothetical. We didn't even know what trial we'd be talking about then. And there are pollsters in the field right now who are going to have an interesting look at what we see here. You could actually see a pop, almost a post-State of the Union, in this case a post-verdict pop for Donald Trump. But does he keep that? Also fundraising. This does not seem to be bothering the mega donors who are gravitating toward Donald Trump, as well as the small dollar donors. As I mentioned before he started here, $35 million raised online. Amazing. Since the beginning of this whole thing, since the verdict less than 24 hours ago. They crashed the WinRed system that Trump uses to raise money last night. You couldn't even get on that app to raise money for a while if you wanted to. So this has been a mobilizing event. Let's see where it goes days and weeks from now.
This is a great point that you made, that when you guys did the polling in terms of if Trump is convicted, will people still vote for him? That didn't specify which conviction. I think I missed that detail, meaning that maybe the Georgia election case, a conviction there, very different than a hush money trial.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's true. I think the idea of convicted felon, right, when we think about the rhetoric or just sort of the aura that brings, it's not a good thing, not to mention someone incarcerated. That's just a different look, too, if you're someone behind bars. Not that either would keep him from running on a legal level. But so this is kind of the unknown. He's dealing with the cards he's been dealt. He's good at that. Joe Biden has been pretty good at staying out of it, outside of his one decision recently to send Robert De Niro to the lower Manhattan courthouse. I'm not sure what else they have up their sleeve right now other than to let Donald Trump keep talking. I think that's Joe Biden's strategy as we speak.
And Joe, I guess we had some conflicting legal opinions today as to whether former President Trump is still under the gag rule. He seemed to say clearly in his remarks that he believes he is.
Yeah, I talked to criminal defense attorney Robert McWhorter about this. He said that technically, yes, this trial is technically not over until sentencing. So therefore, Judge Merchan could in fact enforce the gag order if he wanted to. And I'll remind everybody that we're waiting to hear from the Supreme Court still. The fact that this is done now brings us to June, when we could get a ruling on this presidential this presidential immunity claim that would then potentially unlock the next trial. That's the January 6th trial with special counsel Jack Smith. That could be a very major game changer for this campaign, and it would likely coincide with the final throes of the election. Imagine a world in which that trial was happening when the election took place, or in fact was held between the election and the inauguration. Could we have a president-elect on criminal trial and federal trial here in Washington? All of these remain questions and distinct possibilities.
So we have the benefit of talking about this for just half an hour. You're going to be talking about this for 3 more hours today, as you did yesterday for 3 hours. What are going to be your questions? Like, how do you walk this forward now when there's so many things we don't know?
These are, this is the moment, I think, to get granular. What are the next steps here for Donald Trump's defense? What is that appointment? What is his first meeting with his probation officer going to look like? What will be the venue? What has the Secret Service talked about with New York corrections officials about a potential incarceration? We heard Nick Ackerman, the former Watergate prosecutor, talk about a presidential suite potentially being built at Rikers Island. But I also want to know about the jurors. There are a couple of folks, including our own Eric Larson and his team at Bloomberg. Mark Caputo's another one at the Bulwark, who's going to join us at noon to talk about who these people actually were, what they were going through. Not that we want to reveal identities, but what did these Americans experience? What were their expressions? What did they hear? And what might have gone on inside that jury room? Those are all questions I have.
All right, Joe, thank you so very much. We appreciate it. Joe Matthew, he's co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power, joining us from the Washington, D.C. Bureau. And as you mentioned, Alex, he and his team will be spending a lot of time looking at this and this landmark court case from yesterday, then some of the comments from the former president today, who was just finished speaking. So he's walking away from the lectern there. So interesting. All right, let's get a reset here, Alex, with these markets here. We're going to do that with Mr. John Tucker.
All right, the major stock average is mixed right now. Cool down in the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation gauge. So that's reinforcing hopes that Fed policymakers are going to have room to cut rates this year. The core personal consumption expenditures price gauge posting the smallest gain this year. Yields are lower, and as we say, stocks are mixed as we close out the week. And Steve Chimarron of Federated Global Investment tells us it is actually a stock picker's paradise out there.
You've got enough disinflation that the Fed will start to very slowly and in a very shallow way cut rates. The parts of the equity market right now that are most levered to that, right, the cyclicals that will be levered to that better than expected growth, and the interest rate sensitive names, the dividend payers, small caps, which represent the nexus of both of those things, that's the cheapest part of the market.
Yeah, right now the S&P 500, 28 points lower. That's a decline of 0.6%. We're at 5206 on the index. Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 53 points. It's a rise of 0.1%. The Nasdaq 100, 270 points lower. That is down 1.5%. Some of the stocks on the move. We've been telling you about the Gap. Those shares up close to 25% after their earnings report. And shares of Dell in the opposite direction. They are down 21%. Two-year yield is 3 basis points lower right now. That's at 4.88. The 10-year is down 4 basis points. That is at 4.50. And this report being brought to you by BNY Mellon's Insight. 3 days of countless opportunities to expand your knowledge and put your practice at the forefront of the wealth management industry. June 4th through the 6th in Nashville, Tennessee. Visit insight.bnymellon.com. We check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well here. Big take story today related to the news of the day regarding former President Trump. Wall Street billionaires rush to back Trump. Verdict be damned. A growing number of financial elites are throwing their weight behind Trump who was found guilty in the first criminal trial of a former U.S. president. Sri Natarajan joins us, one of the reporters on that story. Senior finance reporter, Bloomberg News, joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. What did you find in your reporting, Sri, about what some of these billionaires are, what are they thinking as they think about supporting former President Trump in the next election?
In some ways, it's not a surprise, but in some ways, in many ways, it's extraordinary. In almost any other generation, any other era, any other candidate, you would have assumed that there will be this entire crowd of supporters that would be looking to distance themselves from this individual. In this case, most of Trump's deep-pocketed donors are actually rallying around him and using this guilty verdict as a rallying cry to get more support for him. And that has been the trend that we've seen. Those who have been Trump backers and have stood by him through all these years continue to stand by him. Those who have been reluctant travelers don't seem to be getting swayed by the verdict. And in fact, they're using it as an opportunity to drag more people into the Trump fold. And that's extraordinary. A lot of what they're attacking is what they claim is the misuse of the legal system. These are titans of the industry. These are people who've used the legal system, the bedrock of capitalism in this country in some ways, to build, grow, acquire, accumulate wealth. These are the very same people who look at this verdict and suddenly have a number of grave concerns about the carriage of justice, or what they call miscarriage of justice in this case.
So in my world, the first kind of turn was Harold Hamm, billionaire, owns Continental Resources, right? And he supported Nikki Haley, and he was saying he was not going to support President Trump because he just felt like, he just said he wasn't electable. And then slowly, as the momentum couldn't pick up for a moderate, like a Nikki Haley, if we'll just call her a moderate, that eventually the rhetoric started to turn. And I'm wondering how many are similar like that on Wall Street, where in terms of electability, in terms of likability, in terms of focus, they don't want President Trump, but because they weren't able to rally the support behind a moderate or seen as a moderate, they have no choice. How much of it is that versus an actual support?
That's sort of a very interesting point, and I'd like to actually point to two important voices in the story today. One of them, Dan Lufkin. He's 92 today, but he is one of the co-founders of DLJ. He, therefore, had one of the most prominent positions in the industry, right? And here's a man who comes out and says, look, Wall Street has never been known, and this is important the way he frames it. He says, Wall Street has never been known for its values. Is there a willingness to support Trump if it looks like he's on the right track? Yes. He says, I'm not proud of that, and I'm not part of that either, because he was a Nikki Haley supporter and he's definitely staying a never Trumper, but he's saying that is definitely visible. And we have Whitney Tilson, former hedge fund manager, ran a $200 million hedge fund, who says the industry does attract its own crowd of opportunists. And that sort of extends to Trump's backers in the upper rungs of the business community who've come out publicly right now. And his point is, they've concluded Trump is going to win. They don't believe this is a dead heat. They are pretty certain and convinced themselves that Trump is going to win come November. And if he is the next president, then it is in their self-interest to support him early. And you can't discount that logic.
You know, what I see in your story is, you know, kind of self-made billionaires, Steven Schwartzman, Harold Lutnick. What I don't see is corporate CEOs, the CEO of Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble or something like that. That probably says something as well. I mean, if I've got my billions, I don't really care what people think. I can maybe be more open with who I support.
Yes, absolutely. But at the same time, I will also point out that a lot of these corporate CEOs were loud and vocal in 2017, in August 2017, after the white supremacist rallies in Charlottesville, Virginia. They were loud and vocal after Jan 6, 2021. What you have seen in some ways is, in a historic moment like this, right? First ever former president to be tried for sort of on criminal counts, to be found guilty. You would have thought that there would be more in the upper rungs of the business class who would be able to come out and point that out. But they are choosing to remain silent, or at least don't want to express an opinion, and their silence in this case speaks as much as their comments in some of the previous instances.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because something that we saw back in 2016 is it was silent supporters that people voted for Trump on Wall Street in particular, but no one said anything. And that was, in essence, why polls were so wrong and why it caught everyone else so off guard. Is it something the same way? Like, hey, man, I make a lot of money and I want lower taxes straight up. I'm going to vote for Trump, but I can't say it because I'll lose clients.
And some of those who are backing him are kind of also making that point publicly. But yes, in 2016, there was I think it's fair to say, at least on Wall Street, there was a lot more stigma in being able to come out and openly say, I back Donald Trump. Doesn't feel like that so much in 2024.
All right, so we haven't heard from JP. Have we heard from Jamie Dimon, CEOs or Brian Moynihan, anything like that from big Wall Street?
Not particularly, but it is interesting that yesterday Jamie Dimon was sort of the star attraction at this JP Morgan alumni event. This is held at the Morgan Library every year. It's a bit of a tradition among the JP Morgan crowd. And a couple of years ago, he did create quite a bit of a stir where he went on this sort of expletive-laden tirade against Donald Trump. That is Jamie Dimon, the Dean of Finance. This was back when Jancic was still top of everyone's mind. Yesterday, they're meeting a mere 2 hours after this guilty verdict, and Jamie doesn't even reference it. To a tangential question about politics and the outlook, he talks about the need to respect the 74 million voters who voted for Trump because they must have seen that he had done some good things. All fair points, but again, interesting to note what he's choosing to remain silent on at this moment versus what he was vocal about just a couple of years ago.
All right, Sri, thanks so much for joining us. Sri Nanarajan, he is the senior finance reporter for Bloomberg News, joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. The big take story of the day, we love the big take stories, so deeply sourced and reported. Lots of cool graphics for people like me. Wall Street billionaires rush to back Trump, verdict be damned is the headline on that story. So, yeah, Wall Street just following the money. What else is new?
I know. It's true. It's true. It does make polling very tricky, though. But I think it also speaks to the fact that, I know in my oil industry also, a lot of individuals may or may not like Trump as a person or want to be president, but they need the policies to run their company. And that has changed in some ways, but their access to President Biden and the Biden administration for very long was very limited. And the door was shut hard. That's changed a little bit, but that's something interesting too. Like, if you can't get a foot in the door just to talk, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of, when you saw Russia invade Ukraine, then global energy supplies came right back into focus for everybody.
That's right.
And then we're like, oh, we produce a lot of oil here in the U.S. And natural gas and all that kind of good stuff. Boy, thankful for that we're no longer oil importers, that we're net exporters. So that probably opened people's minds here. All right, we're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker in the newsroom. Look at some of the company news we're following. Let's start off with hedge fund manager Bill Ackman. He's selling a stake in Pershing Square, and this is considered to be a prelude to a planned IPO of the investment firm. This is according to our sources. Originally, this was first reported by the Wall Street Journal. Ackman selling a 10% stake in Pershing Square privately. This is a funding round that's supposed to value the firm at probably around $10.5 billion. That's according to the people who asked not to be identified. The money will be used to seed additional funds. The transaction may be announced as soon as next week, and IPO could take place next year. Bank of America loosening restrictions on lending to the firearms and energy industries. This comes from pressure from anti-ESG politicians in Texas and Florida. The bank backing off its ban on lending to companies that make assault-style rifles used for non-military purposes. Rather, the firm's going to make such decisions on a case-by-case basis with senior risk officers. This according to its latest environmental and social risk policy framework. The bank also making similar changes to its energy lending policies. It no longer has a blanket ban on financing for Arctic drilling. And Delta Airlines CEO Ed Bastian says supply chain choke points that developed in the wake of the pandemic do still remain an issue for the aviation industry, alongside extended times for engine repairs that are among factors that are restraining growth in the airline industry. Repair times actually continue to take months rather than weeks, according to the CEO. And that is a look at some of the company stories we're following for you today.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Friday, everybody. We made it to the weekend. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney and John Tucker. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business and economics with our lens through Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. We also keep you updated on world and national news. And for that, we go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex, Paul, John. Donald Trump once again slammed the judge after he was found guilty yesterday of all 34 counts in his New York hush money trial. The former president spoke just a few minutes ago in Trump Tower in Manhattan.
We just went through one of many experiences where we had a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. There's never been a more conflicted judge. Now, I'm under a gag order, which nobody's ever been under. No presidential candidate's ever been under a gag order before. I'm under a gag order, nasty gag order, where I've had to pay thousands of dollars in penalties and fines.
Trump spoke for about 40 minutes and did not take any questions. Meanwhile, Trump's former fixer and lawyer, Michael Cohen, was the star witness for the prosecution. Today, Cohen said he can't understand the support for Trump in his run for the White House.
I'm not sure how it makes any sense. This is not just now a felon, convict, but it's also a man who has openly stated he wants to rewrite the Constitution on day one. He wants to be a dictator. Not my words, his words.
Michael Cohen spoke today to ABC's Good Morning America. Senator Joe Manchin has quit the Democratic Party to become an independent, but that's not likely to shift the balance of power in the chamber. Manchin of West Virginia previously announced he would not run for re-election or for president. It's unclear whether Manchin would still caucus with the Democrats, although his decision wouldn't change the party's control in the Senate because Vice President Kamala Harris has a tie-breaking vote. The Texas Supreme Court has rejected a challenge to one of the most restrictive abortion bans in the U.S., following a lawsuit by women who had serious pregnancy complications. Today's ruling from the court is the latest decision to uphold Texas's abortion ban, which critics say does not offer enough clarity over when exceptions are allowed. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, John.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Barr. And here's a great way to end the show. It puts a smile on your face. It was the National Spelling Bee the other day. AP reporting that Bruhat Soma it won the Spelling Bees, 12 years old, 7th grader from Tampa, Florida, and they ended in a tiebreaker. And he went through 30 words in 90 seconds Thursday night. I definitely could not spell 30 words in 90 seconds.
It was like watching an old Password episode. It was great because the lightning round came and my man was just going. I can't spell word the dog.
I don't even know what those words mean.
Well,
One youngster got tripped up by imminent, which is a homonym of imminent. So
tricky.
it's IMMA versus IMMI. I mean, it was, jeez.
Yeah, no way. Apparently, the winner worked every day for 6 months. He rehearsed the spell off every day for 6 months. Yep. He said he's pretty confident that he had a chance of winning because he'd been working so hard. But, I mean, pretty much everyone works really hard for these things. He got a trophy and more than $50,000 in cash and prizes. Like, awesome.
Are we putting too much pressure on these kids?
Oh, well, this is a different question.
Do I sound like a wimp now?
No. Yes, we are. But what if he actually wanted it? So how do you know?
All right.
I mean, I'm just saying, I have no idea. Like, if this was his dream, like, rock on for your dream, man. That's awesome. The finals began with just 8 spellers, the fewest since 2010, so it was pretty boring. And then it ramped up with this tiebreaker, and he wins 30 words in 90 seconds.
Jumano, Jumano, a group of Native Americans that lived in the Southwest and South Plains between until around 1700. That was one of the words.
Jumano?
Yeah.
Jumino? A-N-O.
See, boom, you're out like first round.
Now. It's just like, no
But I wasn't even
chance.
pretending that I was going to win. It's not. Spell check is my friend.
Yes, spell check.
Yeah. Happy weekend, everybody. That wraps it up for John Paul and myself. We will see you on Monday morning. Balance of Power with Joe Matthew is up next. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Donald Trump responds to the verdict. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the former president delivers a stem winder today from Trump Tower following his guilty conviction, 34 criminal charges, which we're going to discuss with June Grasso at Bloomberg Law, knowing now that the former president has raised some $35 million since the verdict was announced. Insights coming up from Mark Caputo, the man behind the MAGAville newsletter, was in the courthouse for the conviction with us today on Bloomberg. With analysis from our political panel. What does this mean for the convention for a VP pick and for the race at large? We have Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, and it's all after a look at Wall Street. We start there right now, as always, with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew. Indeed, happy Friday. We have got the Dow higher, S&P, NASDAQ, both in the red right now. 10-year, 4.50% with a 2-year, 4.88%. World's biggest bond market extending this month's rally after a cool down in the Fed's preferred inflation gauge reinforce hopes that policymakers will have room to cut rates this year. S&P down 30, drop there of 0.6%. Dow Industrials up 28, up 0.1, while NASDAQ is now lower by 227 points, a decline there of 1.4%. Wall Street did get a degree of relief after the so-called core personal consumption expenditures price gauge came in line with estimates while posting the smallest gain this year. John Stoltzfus is Chief Investment Officer at Oppenheimer.
We think that the Fed is doing the job. It's on the case. It's bringing down the level of inflation, evident by the numbers today and over the last couple of weeks. But inflation is still an issue.
Spot gold now down 0.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.3%. Dell Technologies down the most in 4 years after its first revenue increase since 2022 was not enough to impress investors with high expectations for the company's AI server business. Dell shares plunging now by 21.8%. Sources tell Bloomberg Carl Icahn has amassed a sizable position in hotel and casino operator Caesars Entertainment. Caesars shares, they're surging now by 14.8%. And Penn Entertainment shares are soaring after an activist investor called for the sale of the casino company. Penn shares, they're up by 16.7%. Recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow holding on to a gain of just about 0.1%. S&P down 0.6. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, the Friday edition. Here he is, Joe Matthew.
Yes, indeed, Charlie Pellet. We thank you, Charlie, with his eyes on Wall Street for us. Here on the fastest show in politics. Yeah, welcome to Friday. You made it to the threshold of the weekend. Balance of Power is live from Washington after quite the speech there from Donald Trump at Trump Tower. Billed as a press conference, and he never took one question in almost an hour of speaking. And you heard some pretty interesting commentary there. I can still hear Charlie Pellet if that's by design. He started with the border, which was interesting, moved on to his commentary on the case, a highly conflicted judge, which we've heard him say before, talked about the gag order, and then got on to Joe Biden. This was done by Washington. He said this was all done by Biden and his people. There wasn't too much new there, although he did call Joe Biden a Manchurian candidate today. Got on to January 6th, talked about the National Guard, whether he attacked the driver in the limousine. That was basically the gist of it. But here's the news, guys. 34 counts equals $34 million. The Trump campaign says it has raised a record $34.8 million in small dollar online contributions off of the conviction. That is nearly double his previous record. Remarkable. So coming up, we're going to talk to Mark Caputo at the Magaville newsletter. First, it's June Grasso at World Headquarters in New York. The host of Bloomberg Law has owned this story since the trial began. And here we are, June. We actually have a verdict. I have to admit, we were pretty floored last night at how quickly all 34 guilties were announced. A jury that some thought would be hung was in sync. What are your thoughts today?
Well, I too was floored by the fact that they came back so fast, and that's because they had asked these questions that basically started at the beginning of the trial. You know, started with Pecker's testimony and Cohen's testimony, and then they seemed confused about the jury instructions. So, I mean, I don't know whether or when we're going to find out what happened inside that jury room, whether they were just being methodical and going through everything to make sure they were correct, or whether there were a couple of jurors who were unsure or were holdouts. So, I mean, this is a vindication for Alvin Bragg. I mean, he's been criticized and mocked and everything else for bringing this case, and that the case was the weakest, which it probably still is, the weakest of the cases brought against Donald Trump. And yet, you know, in his press conference, he was completely sort of even-tempered and didn't really take any bows, just said he was doing his job. And this kind of case is what they bring a lot in the district attorney's office, which of course is not really true because this is the first time. But now he's the first prosecutor to get a conviction of a former president on a felony. So, he has, I guess he'll be celebrating this weekend.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I'm curious about process at this point, June, and you have a good sense of what's coming next. Donald Trump's going to have to meet with a probation officer at some point here. Will apparently conduct an interview for a pre-sentencing report. How's all this going to happen when you're dealing with someone with a Secret Service detail and a mob of reporters?
That's so funny because that hit me too as well when I was thinking about this and reading about it. There's just as part of the process, the probation officer does an interview with the convicted defendant, and that's a chance for the defendant to sort of convince the probation officer that he or she should be given a lesser sentence or probation. But I just can't imagine what that interview will be like with Donald Trump. That's just part of the process, and the probation officer will give a recommendation to the judge, and then you'll have both the defense and the prosecution giving recommendations to the judge for what they think the sentence should be. And last night, the DA would not say whether or not they'll be asking for jail time, but you have to believe that they will ask for jail time in this case. And, then it'll be up to the judge on July 11th to decide the sentence. And people I've talked to, they've been split about whether or not they think he'll give legal experts jail time to Trump or not. I mean, on the one hand, you'd say, well, this is a question of equality under the law, everyone treated the same, so maybe he will get a sentence. On the other hand, if he's treated the same, he's a 77-year-old man who has never been convicted of a crime before. So why would you send him to prison, particularly when you consider all the ramifications of Secret Service, et cetera? So it's going to be a really interesting, decision for Justice Merchan, and a really tough one, I imagine.
A really tough one. We're not going to hear an appeal until after sentencing, correct? That is technically, this is still a trial that is underway until we get to July 11th.
Right. They can file the appeal, but I'm sure they'll start working on it. And you can hear what the appellate issues are. Just for example, from what Trump said yesterday and today, he talked about the fact that the judge didn't give him a venue change. He talked about the fact that their expert witness wasn't allowed to testify in the way they wanted to. Then you also have the fact that this is a novel theory that's never been, reached the appellate courts, that's never been tested before. There's Stormy Daniels' testimony that perhaps people say went a little too far into detail. So there are a lot of appellate issues here. But remember that getting an appeal, getting a conviction overturned is very rare. So it's not as, 50-50 chance or whatever. So it's an uphill battle for the defense, but they're going to put everything into it. And they do have a lot of issues that they can raise on appeal.
This is why we're subscribed to Bloomberg Law, 6 p.m. New York time, here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite and on YouTube. Thank you, June,
my pleasure,
for being so helpful through this. We're not done with you yet, by the way. We've got a lot still to talk about. June 11th, we'll be meeting June Grasso right here at this time. The reporting by Mark Caputo has been really fascinating. You heard me refer to the Bulwark earlier in the week. He's the author of the Magaville newsletter and has had a great account of what was going on inside this courtroom, remembering we never had the benefits of cameras and microphones. Bloomberg's team was feeding us live information. Mark was getting fascinating firsthand accounts from inside the room. And Mark, it's great to have you. Thanks for coming to talk to us today on Bloomberg. There have been a lot of questions about the jury. These 12 people were whisked out the back door in black vans last night. We don't talk about their identities on the air, although some have come close. There were concerns about, maybe a MAGA holdout or a Joe Biden mole or something like that with some of the reporting on this jury. They turned out to be unanimous. Were you surprised? Not hearing Mark if you guys are. Can anybody hear Mark? There we go. There we go. Go for it. Yeah, take it away.
All right. Is this thing on, as they say?
Yes.
Yeah, not surprised. Different jurisdictions have different jury pools, and jury pools often reflect an electorate. Only 14.5% of people in Manhattan voted for Donald Trump. That makes a difference. If this case were tried in Alabama, I doubt that he would have been convicted, to be honest. Probably would have been a hung jury. They were hoping in the Trump camp for a hung jury. They had basically given up hope of an acquittal. And heading into the verdict, heading into closing arguments, there was just a mounting amount of buzz in Magaville, so to speak, that there was one juror who seemed like a friendly, was making eye contact when Donald Trump's surrogates came in. His face, quote, lit up this jurors. And so there was just this hope that there was going to be a hung jury. But it was just that, a hope. I mean, as I wrote in my story, that, trials are sort of like a stage of grief. They're like a grieving process for a defendant. And their hopes pinned on this one juror hanging the rest of the jury and leading to a mistrial was sort of like the bargaining stage of grief. And well, as we saw, Donald Trump now has to hit the acceptance level, or the acceptance stage.
Yeah, we're going through these stages pretty quickly here. I'm not seeing or sensing a lot of grief In the Republican Party, though, Mark, and I'd love for you to bring me inside Magaville this morning. We heard
I think they're at the
that's
at the anger
that's a
stage.
great way of putting it, and clearly Donald Trump was too in the speech, the news conference that didn't include a reporter's question. Look, we heard from Mike Johnson by 5:10 p.m. That was less than 10 minutes after the verdict. Shameful charges, absurd verdict, shameful day in American history. Senator Marco Rubio, don't just get angry about this travesty, get even. What do you do with all this anger in Washington?
Well, we're about to find out. Now, the question is, you referenced from earlier the press conference that former President Trump had. One of the things that we're all sitting around wondering is, will this have an effect on the election, on the electorate? So far during the trial, the answer to that's been no. Now that he's a convicted felon, how does Donald Trump message this? How does he tell those swing voters out there, those persuadable voters who might not want to vote for him, that they should ignore this verdict, or that the verdict was unfair? I'm not sure he's very concise, cogent, and clear about that. And as you point out, he has this press conference, he's sort of talking about immigration, which you can't blame him on one hand because he is winning on the issue of immigration, the polls. He loses in polling to Joe Biden when it's a question of character. And that's just very dicey ground for Donald Trump. And I'm not sure how persuasive he is about this, but I'm also not sure how much the electorate overall cares about this and to what degree it's going to make a difference. We're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, you're right. And people who pretend to have answers to that are really guessing at this point. What does this mean? 4 days before a convention, we're going to announce a vice president in the middle of this? How do you do all that in the same week?
We're going to find out. I don't know. As for the possible VP selections, there's probably a good bet that this elevates the profile of, you'd mentioned Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, Tom Cotton. Those are among people on sort of the campaign shortlist that they want Donald Trump to consider as a running mate. They're all lawyers. They're all skilled at arguing and fighting back, and to my point earlier, making cogent and clear arguments. Whether you buy them or not probably depends on your politics. But Trump probably needs that more than ever now, and I think the importance of a running mate has now been elevated, especially what if he winds up in the clink, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're going to need somebody out there. So it's just brought an extra amount of attention and importance to that issue.
So they're going to need a real aggressive, it sounds like, retail campaigner. But let's explore that for a minute. Nick Ackerman, the former Watergate prosecutor, says they could be talking about creating a presidential suite at Rikers Island. CBS News says the Secret Service has talked to New York corrections officials. It's not outside of the realm that this judge does some jail time in the sentencing here. I don't know what happens then, Mark. What happens to your inbox at Magaville when that's announced?
I have absolutely no idea. This is just something that's just hard to contemplate. The entire matter is.
Well, that's a very good answer. Do you worry about violence?
I mean, me probably not particularly, but I think it's. I wouldn't rule it out. I think if Donald Trump actually gets incarcerated for a significant period of time before the election, I think it probably would raise the likelihood of it. But its actual likelihood, I just don't know. If you had asked me before
January 6th. He's called himself a political
6th,
prisoner. Yeah.
Well,
does that
too.
brand work?
Well, so far he's cast himself as a victim who has been persecuted since 2016. Donald Trump has, and he lost the 2020 election. But so far, if you believe all of the polling, or almost all of the polling, he is marginally beating Joe Biden in this race. And people have so far been willing to overlook his legal troubles. But how they perceive him now, it's just unclear, and it's just going to be a matter in part of how Donald Trump handles himself. And to a degree, how some of his followers, to your point about possibility of violence, handle themselves. I just I'm not a prophet. I have no clue.
And thus, the power of martyrdom is impossible to predict in that case, isn't it?
Well, yeah, martyrs usually wind up dying, so that's probably not something he wants to embark on.
Right. Let's not suggest that either, Mark. We're just getting to know each other again. Come back and see us soon. Mark Caputo, find the Magaville newsletter at the Bulwark. It's great to see you, Mark, and thank you for your insights today. Look, we've got a lot to talk about around this. There are still so many questions following this unprecedented event with a former president, now a convicted felon. We heard from Donald Trump a bit earlier. We brought you his remarks from Trump Tower in New York. We'll discuss the political implications here further with Gregory Cordy coming up in our panel. Rick and Jeannie are with us later this hour on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
Wall Street, we do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks trading mixed with the S&P 500 index below 5,200 right now. The Dow holding on to a 29-point gain, up less than 0.1%. S&P down 41, drop there of 0.8%, while NASDAQ hard hit today, down 1.7%, down 283 points. Dell shares after earnings, they're down by 22%. Gap shares are advancing after reporting better than expected results and raising its outlook for the full year. Gap shares up now by 27%. Meanwhile, warehouse club Costco lower after reporting third quarter results. Costco right now down by 2.4%. Stocks again trading mixed. S&P lower by 42, down 0.8. The Dow up 0.1%. Nasdaq down 1.7%. 10-year 4.50% with the 2-year 4.88%. Spot gold down 0.4%, 23.33 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.6%, 77.44 a barrel. Again, recapping a mixed Friday here with the S&P now lower by 42 points. Key takeaway trading below 5,200. Balance of power continues now. Back to go to Washington, and once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power. It's good to see you on Bloomberg Radio, on YouTube, where you can search Bloomberg Global News to find our live stream, or, of course, on satellite radio. With a lot to talk about in the wake of this breaking news, shocking to many people last evening, 34 guilty counts. Donald Trump speaking about them earlier today from Trump Tower. A press conference, as it was billed, did not include a single question from a reporter in Trump Tower. Certainly not Gregory Cordy, who's with us today at the table here in Washington, Bloomberg White House and politics reporter with his eyes on the campaign trail. Great to see you, Gregory. We were talking shortly after this all transpired last night, and I'd love your take, since you've been so steeped in the research here, on what polls we're talking about. I know that we did have numbers going back to January at Bloomberg that asked independents, swing state voters, what they would think about a conviction, what they would think about incarceration. But there's been a lot of noise around this. Do we have any sense of what impact this will have?
Yeah, so here are the numbers if you look at the polls. And I'm going to talk about our Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll of swing state voters, because, A, the swing state voters are the most important to talk about here, but also it's a poll, obviously, that I know the best. But these are numbers that are reflected in other polls that are out there, give or take. So 53% of swing state voters said they would be somewhat or very less likely to vote for Trump if he were convicted. And even less likely if he were sentenced on that crime. Now, that 53%, many of them weren't going to vote for him to begin with, right? So it's really the 17% is the number that I'm focused on. 17% of people who said they were going to vote for Trump said, I would reconsider if I had that new information. 17%, interesting number. That's about the amount of support that Nikki Haley gets within the Republican Party. So if you want to think about these as those Nikki Haley, more traditional Republicans, that's probably not a bad comparison to make. And of those 17%, 8% said they would be very less likely to vote for Trump if he were convicted. Okay. So those are considerable numbers, given how close all of these races are in these swing states.
Be the difference maker.
Now I'm going to argue against our own poll here. And the reason is, if you ask a hypothetical question, you get a hypothetical answer, right? So these may well be voters who say, look, I wouldn't vote for him if he was convicted, but I don't think he's going to get convicted. That's now a counterfactual, right? He has been convicted. We know what has happened. Right. And so it's going to be very important and interesting to see over the next few days, and I would expect we would get some more data by Sunday from a number of different high-quality polls that could give us a little bit more input on this. Former President Trump himself at his so-called news conference, you don't get to call it a news conference if you don't answer questions. But he cited this Daily News poll that has him continuing up. That's a flash overnight poll. Wouldn't put too much stock in it. No. But look, this is certainly going to energize his base. It is turbocharge his fundraising. God knows. $34 million in less than a day is more than he usually gets in 2 or 3 weeks. Yes, yeah. And if, he can continue to gin up his supporters on this issue, he's certainly going to energize his voters to show up and to support him with a check or two. $1 million for each count is quite amazing how that works out. So you just said a couple of interesting things, because this could be any number of trials we were asking people about back in January, right? We could still have, by the way, a January 6th Jack Smith trial. Do we know how
these various indictments stack up in voters' minds?
That's very interesting because we asked the numbers that I just gave you were from our January poll, and we had that same follow-up question is, okay, do one of these cases matter more than others? So in our February poll, we asked on each one of these 4 criminal cases individually, and what we found was it really doesn't matter. Voters aren't really differentiating between this Alvin Bragg case in Manhattan about falsified business documents as opposed to the Jack Smith cases about election, what happened on January 6th, or efforts to overturn the election, or the Mar-a-Lago case in Florida that has to do with classified documents. Voters pretty much put those all into the same bag.
What did you make of the speech, by the way? He started on the border. This is supposed to be, again, a news conference on this first ever criminal conviction of a former president. Start on the border. They're ruining our country. They don't want you to have cars, he said. Then he got into the case a little bit, talked about some of the stuff that we've heard before. It was rigged. It was Joe Biden, even though it's a state court. Was there anything new here? Are you surprised he showed up with kind of the same retribution speech?
Yeah, if you missed it and you're wondering whether he said anything you haven't heard before, the answer is probably no. Yeah. This was, as you say, a little bit in between these daily statements that he's given outside of court for the past 5-6 weeks and a rally. I liked what our colleague David Gura, how he put it from outside the courthouse or outside Trump Tower earlier this morning. It was kind of a supercut of Trump grievances over the trial, interspersed with all of his usual campaign pronouncements about immigration and the state of the country.
He called Joe Biden the dumbest president we've ever had. He got some laughter in the crowd, which also made me wonder how many reporters were there versus supporters. He got into January 6th, whether he called the National Guard. I mean, this really was, we were all over the place on this. But he talked about whether he would have testified. He said, I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify, but I would have loved to have testified. He, of course, never stood a chance of testifying in this trial, right?
He has the constitutional right to testify. He also has the constitutional right under the Fifth Amendment not to testify and not have that held against him. He chose not to testify. Look, and can you have it both ways in the court of public opinion? That's the argument he's going to make. I think what he said was, if he had said it's a beautiful day and it's raining outside, he might have been indicted for, and then he sort of trailed off to talk about the actual weather outside. So look, it's Trump. You kind of expect that from him, and the jury made the decision based on the evidence they had without his testimony.
Sometimes you say things enough times, and people start to believe it or consider it to be fact or canon. And he keeps talking about this weaponization of government and that this is Joe Biden's case. He said, quote, I'm the leading person for president. I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put 2 sentences together, given by a court, and they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, unquote. Do we have any reason to believe that?
We don't. And, a couple of weeks ago, Trump came out of the courtroom and made that exact same point, but then he added a qualification to it. He said, I can't prove that, but I think it's true. Right. So, again, this is one of those arguments that the former president's going to make. Look, Alvin Bragg is also a Democrat. In this super partisan, polarized country that we live in now, it's hard to dismiss the political aspect to all of this. Mm-hmm. It's an open question. If the same behavior had happened in a Republican jurisdiction, would the former president have been indicted? I don't know. I can only speculate that it would be less likely to happen that way, right? So, does he have a point? Look, that's up to each individual voter to decide, and people are going to bring their own partisan frames to that question.
We mentioned this $34.8 million number, small dollar online contributions. The whales are lining up too, though. The mega donors are not spooked by this.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Even before the verdict yesterday, we started to see some of the Wall Street titans, people like Bill Ackman, leaning towards supporting the former president here. They have been somewhat on the sidelines. Bill Ackman's a very interesting guy because he's been looking for any alternative to a Trump-Biden rematch, right?
Right.
He supported Dean
He's
Phillips.
made that clear.
He's been curious about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And now seems to be maybe landing back towards President Trump. This has been an agonizing election cycle for Wall Street to try to figure out who is in their best interest. They like Trump policies. They like the idea of tax cuts. They like his views on regulation. They're not always so sure about his respect for the rule of law, which is very important in markets.
I'm surprised why we didn't hear about any issues today. Couldn't Donald Trump have gone in there and said, hey, we're going to fight this. I've got the entire Republican Party. America's at my back. We're going to make the tax cuts permanent. We're going to start going through a checklist of things that I can do if you just elect me one more time.
And in this case, I think, very often Donald Trump is his own worst enemy, right? On the messaging, he is so aggrieved by what is happening to him in the courtroom that it has distracted him. And look, he has been in a courtroom. He's been stuck there. This is the hand that he's dealt.
That's right.
But yes, as of now, we have not seen a pivot back to the campaign. And look, the sentencing is going to be July 11th. That's 4 days before the start of the Republican National Convention.
Can't imagine.
You have to think that all of these legal issues are going to continue to color Trump's rhetoric up until the convention and through the convention.
We're going to be in a convention hall where he's doing a jailhouse call on the big screen. Is this?
That's going to be up to one person, and that's Judge Marchant.
Unbelievable. I'm really glad you could come by today. Gregory Cordy with us from the campaign trail to Washington and right here to the table at Bloomberg. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next. I'm really glad we've got Rick and Jeannie with us after we check world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. Donald Trump, speaking out about yesterday's guilty verdict, continues to insist the trial was not fair and the judge biased.
I would have testified. I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify because as soon as you testify, anybody, if it were George Washington, don't testify because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong and then they sue you for perjury.
Trump's team is expected to file an appeal. Sentencing is set for July 11th. That guilty verdict seems to have rattled Trump's donors. The Trump campaign says it has raised nearly $35 million in less than 24 hours after the verdict was announced. The campaign says nearly 30% were first-time donors using the Republican Party's Win Red online platform to raise money. And Trump's former lawyer and so-called fixer, the prosecution's star witness, Michael Cohen, told ABC's Good Morning America he wishes he never met Trump.
As hard as it is on me watching my family suffer as a direct result of my actions and the misloyalty that I gave to Donald, it's something that haunts me every day.
Many Republicans say Trump should never have been charged, like Senator Tom Cotton.
I'm going to continue to support Donald Trump strongly, work to elect him to the White House, work to elect a working Republican majority to the Congress to help implement an agenda that will begin to repair the damage that Joe Biden has inflicted on America.
Republican Senator Tom Cotton there, and Democrats say the verdict needs to be respected. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
1240 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg S&P 500 index trading below 5,200, 51.98 right now. Big tech selling off. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index down 1.6%, tumbling 264 points. NASDAQ 100 Index down 1.7%. S&P lower by 0.7. The Dow up 86, a gain there of 0.2%. 10-year 4.50% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.88%. Gold down $8 the ounce, down 0.4%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is down 0.9%. The Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation moderated in April. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Core PCE posted the smallest increase of the year, rising just 0.2%, offering Fed officials some solace. Even so, fresh research by Fed analysts suggests it may take 3 more years for inflation to fall to the central bank's target. There are also some signs America's economy could be losing some ground. Consumer spending, adjusted for inflation, dropped for the first time since January. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Bank of America is loosening restrictions on lending to the firearms and energy industries amid pressure from anti-ESG politicians in Texas and Florida. The bank has backed off of its ban on lending to companies that make assault-style guns used for non-military purposes. Michael Bloomberg, founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, parent of Bloomberg Radio, is a donor to groups that support gun control, including Everytown for Gun Safety. Shares of Bank of America, they're up right now by 1.6%. Recapping, we're looking at a mixed Friday here. S&P down 34 now, down 0.6%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Lots going on. And once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. Here we are this day after the big verdict with a lot of questions and some insights on the way forward. Next couple of months here, next 41 days, I guess it is, are going to be pretty wild as we watch the former president of the United States meet with a probation officer, prepare to choose a vice presidential candidate, and attend a convention that could be interrupted by some form of detention. We were lucky to be here on the air on Balance of Power, the late edition, when all of this transpired last night. I'm glad that you were with us, too, here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. And I've been really looking forward to talking to Rick and Jeannie about this. Our political signature panel is back with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. Rick, you've thrown a convention. You've run a presidential campaign. I'm not sure where you go from here when there's a January 11th sentencing, make that July 11th, and a July 15th convention. Is this a campaign that needs to prepare for a big screen here with Donald Trump delivering a speech by video?
You know, I think that arrangements can be made to make sure he's present at the convention. I'm not exactly sure, from what I can tell from all the lawyers I've heard on commentary, that the judge is blind to the current campaign cycle and wouldn't afford Trump the opportunity to go to the convention, claim his nomination, and make a speech. But look, this is the most unpredictable presidential campaign in history, right? I mean, it's just nothing is going as you would have planned, and I'm sure the convention organizers will make do. We had a hurricane hit the United States on the first day of our convention, and we wound up canceling the first day and having people beaming in like the President of the United States on Tuesday. So the reality is that you can do this stuff on the fly. It's not the preference, but it certainly is within the realm of possibility.
I'm sure you both heard the president, saw him, former president, from Trump Tower, Donald Trump in front of the American flags at the Trump podium. I was threatened with jail. I'm under a gag order by a man who cannot put 2 sentences together. This is all done by Biden and his people. This is done by Washington. Jeannie, is that the campaign message from here to November?
Yeah, it's the same campaign message we've been hearing for several months. We will keep hearing it. I think the key message I took away from it was his often repeated statement that if they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. And that to me explains a lot about the fundraising that we've heard so much about and the support. So, you know, I am a little stuck on the fact that I'm not going to have a car anymore. You're going to have to explain this to me, Joe Matthew. I was confused by that. That was very strange. There were a couple of strange moments, actually, when he said things that I was, it was a lot of word salad. But the key issue was that this is a political persecution. I am standing in the doorway blocking them from doing this to you. And that is an effective message for members of his base. One thing I was struck by is Hugh Hewitt saying that this is the equivalent, what happened yesterday in Manhattan with the verdict of the Dobbs decision for Democrats. This is the equivalent for Republicans. I don't know if that's true, but that is the kind of momentum that I think Democrats have to be clear can really occur in the case like this. So hard for me to believe, but that is where we are at this moment. And that $34 million, if it's true and the FEC supports it, is, one piece of evidence of that.
Well, I'd like to hear from you on the money here, Rick. These are small dollar donations, $34.8 million, $1 million for each count. Off the conviction, what does that tell you about the landscape here when it comes to money?
Yeah, look, I mean, Donald Trump has been able to fundraise off the indictments. Now, clear evidence that he's fundraising off convictions. Maybe he ought to line up some of these other trials to hurry up, because honestly, I can raise even more money if I get convicted of that. I say that tongue in cheek, but $34.8 million overnight. So that's quite a haul. That's a lot of money, and it comes at a time when his direct mail or online fundraising and small dollar donations had really taken a nosedive after the last indictment, and so. There's no question these legal cases have helped his fundraising, and the indictments, no question, helped his standing within the party. I think that anybody who calculated that these things would be the end of Donald Trump really didn't understand the legacy of this. But I would say that I think this Dodd issue is actually relevant in the sense that anything that gets his base energized is important, because his base does not vote at as high a percentage rate as Joe Biden's does. And so on any given day, Biden's voters are much more likely to turn out to vote than Trump's are. And so he has to make up that difference if he wants to make the polls accurate. And right now, I don't think anybody's taking propensity to vote into much consideration in these surveys.
Jeannie, not only did Donald Trump say they want to stop you from having cars, that was the quote, he also said that Joe Biden was a Manchurian candidate. Now, maybe you've seen the movie Manchurian Candidate. Cambridge Dictionary defines that as a person who is not loyal to or who harms their own country or political party because they are under the control of influence of another country or party. I don't know if he likes Frank Sinatra movies or Denzel Washington, Jeannie, but is that actually a message? Can Donald Trump frame Joe Biden as an 80-something-year-old Manchurian candidate?
He can try. One thing that struck me when I heard that was, both of these guys, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, they really have to realize that a large majority of the voters in 2024, this movie is very, very old. I can tell you firsthand, when I talk about 9/11 in class, students say, oh, I wasn't born then. So you're talking about a Frank Sinatra movie? Okay, even Denzel Washington seems old to them. So putting that aside, I think he can, sorry about my rant, Joe. I think he can try to do it.
Like this.
But this, I also thought that's the pot calling the kettle black. I'm not sure that's the most effective argument. He has the same argument to make he's long been making, which is they are coming for you and I am standing in the way. This is a political persecution. He's going to run with that. It is an effective message. The question, though, as it pertains to 24 is not as effective with his base, because we know it is can he get those Nikki Haley moderate independent voters that way? And, you know, I think he faces real trouble there in the swing states.
Rick, you're going to prefer the Sinatra version, I'm guessing, right?
Queen of Diamonds, Joe. Queen of Diamonds.
Fantastic. Our signature panel is back next hour. We're going to have a lot more on the political impact, the ramifications, the next steps here in Donald Trump's legal and political journey, not to mention Joe Biden's with huge news today on the terminal. Biden allows Ukraine to hit some Russia targets with U.S. weapons. We started this week talking with Ukraine Defense Advisor Yuri Sak, making the case for this. And as we've seen so many times, a no turns to a yes, but there are qualifications here. And Bloomberg national security correspondent Dan Flatley joins us at the table for more on this. Dan, it's important. We wanted to get to the story because we've been watching this evolution once again before our eyes. But this will be limited in scope. How will this work?
Right. So the idea here is to basically give the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian military, the ability to stop some of the attacks on Kharkiv. Yeah. And the way to do that is to get intelligence or get some indication that if the Russians are firing on that area, you can preliminarily or proactively strike at some of their weaponry or some of their supply lines and things like that. Now, obviously, this is a huge deal because this is the first time in the war, at least publicly, that we know where the U.S. has given the Ukrainian military the go-ahead to use U.S. weapons.
Which we were told would be escalatory.
Right, on Russian territory. And this is a situation that the administration has wanted to avoid for the past 2 years. And so why are we here now? We're here because things are not going so well in the sense that you now have the Ukrainian military trying to defend or take back some territory that they had already taken back. So things are not trending in the right direction, at least in this one limited area. Yeah. So you need to somehow change the fight, and this is one way to do it.
So this speaks, it sounds like more to the situation in Kharkiv than a policy change that might be coming more broadly, or is it? If this does not prove to be escalatory, does the U.S. maybe loosen the reins further?
I think that they would be very reluctant to do that. I think the U.S., the Biden administration, would be very reluctant to see this policy expand beyond this limited use for all the reasons that we talked about. But this is really, you know, the story of the last 50, 60, 70 years of U.S. policy when it comes to Russia and the Soviet Union before, where you have fighting taking place in territories that aren't directly, involved, or among countries that aren't directly involved. But you have the risk, of course, of nuclear conflict. Yeah, and so, not to raise that specter on a Friday afternoon,
but this is what we're talking about.
We're talking about historical events today. And this is one of those things that could potentially have more significance over the long run than even what we've seen with former President Trump in the last 24 hours. So it's something to keep a very close eye on. But your question was, do they expand this beyond this one limited use? I think they would be very reluctant to do that for all of those reasons.
I'm struck by the dichotomy here between what's happening in Israel, as we learned that it was, in fact, a U.S.-provided bomb that killed some 45 Palestinian civilians last weekend. In fact, Israel is using U.S.-provided weapons to go on the offense in Gaza, but Ukraine has one arm tied behind its back in this case. Did that help to loosen up the view on this, or
yeah, it's a good question. I think the administration would probably say that those are two very different situations.
And they are,
right?
Yeah.
With regard to Israel and Gaza and the strike in Rafah, Biden is treading a very difficult line there, trying to keep the balance of power in the Middle East, as their administration is working on this deal with Saudi Arabia, as they're trying to achieve normalization between the two countries, between Saudi Arabia and Israel, as they're trying to get security guarantees with Saudi Arabia. They're trying to, do all this, and they don't want to upset the balance of power. They don't want to have a complete shift in longstanding U.S. policy backing one of its major allies in the Middle East, which is Israel. But obviously, as we've talked about before, Joe, this is Rafah is a very densely populated area with a lot of temporary housing, a lot of places that could catch fire, that you could have devastating consequences very quickly. So it's a very difficult situation with regard to.
Yeah, and we could learn a lot more from this investigation. The IDF still believes there was some sort of depot or fuel that was being stored nearby, and we have a lot to learn there with your help. Dan Flatley, great to see you, and thank you for great reporting as always here at Bloomberg. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Kaylee's coming in next for Hour 2 of Balance of Power. Stay with us on Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power.
Donald Trump raises millions on the verdict. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the former president delivers a stem winder from Trump Tower this day after being found guilty on 34 criminal charges. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington this day after the breaking news. Kaylee, remarkable updates here on fundraising for the Trump campaign. He's certainly not getting poorer.
Yeah, yesterday was a story of a historic moment of a former American president and presumptive Republican nominee suddenly adding a new title to that list, which is convicted felon. And yet, to this point, it seems only to be working to his benefit, at least if dollars count as kind of votes until the real voting happens. According to the Trump campaign, $34.8 million raised in the aftermath of the verdict.
$1 million for each count, roughly, here. As our political analyst Rick Davis said earlier, maybe Donald Trump should be inviting further trials here so he can make more money on the trail. This is a temporary situation, but it's one we can't ignore. The fundraising platform used by the Trump campaign actually crashed during our coverage last night, Kaylee. 30% of the donors were first-timers for Donald Trump.
And this is something that Donald Trump was calling a lot of attention to in his what was dubbed as a press conference at Trump Tower earlier this morning, although he did not take any questions from the press. And really, it was just a long list of grievances against the Biden administration and the many players who were involved in this trial. We're going to have more in just a moment with Jim Zirin, former federal prosecutor. First, though, let's get a check on the markets up in New York with Charlie Pellet. How we looking, Charlie? Happy Friday.
A lot of red on the screen here, especially in tech land, Kaylee and Joe. We have got the S&P right now down 30, a drop right now of just about 0.6%. We've got the Dow Industrials up 130 now, up 0.3%, and NASDAQ lower by 238, drop there of just about 1.4%. S&P trading right around that 5,200 level. Got to keep it locked into Bloomberg Television and Radio to see how things shake out at the close. We are on track, though, for a losing week for the S&P. Again, the S&P right now down 0.6%. 10-year 4.51%, the 2-year 4.88%. Spot gold down 0.5%, 23.31 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude oil trading lower by 0.7%. Dell falling the most in 4 years after its first revenue increase since 2022 was not enough to impress investors. Dell shares are plunging now by 20.8%. Sources tell Bloomberg Carl Icahn has amassed a sizable position in hotel and casino operator Caesars Entertainment. Caesars shares surging on that report, up 10.6%. In the meantime, Penn Entertainment shares are soaring after an activist investor called for the sale of the casino company. Penn up 17.3%. Recapping, S&P down 29, drop there of 0.6%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington once again. Your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet live in Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. Thank you so much. New York certainly has been a busy town today, as this morning near Trump Tower, there were a lot of protesters and a lot of media present as Donald Trump gave his day after press conference. After being found guilty on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, he had much to say, including flexing his ability to fundraise off of this verdict. Here he was earlier this morning.
Last night, we just got a report this morning, in the history of politics, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody will find that I'm wrong, maybe, but I don't think so. They raised with small money donors, meaning like $21, $42, $53, $38, a record $39 million in about a 10-hour period.
Raising tens of millions of dollars off the conviction. By the way, the official number we got earlier was 34.8. Maybe they're making more, according to the president, though, as he says, maybe someone will tell him that he's wrong. But it was a meandering speech. It was billed as a news conference, a press conference. Kaylee, not one question was taken from a reporter, and there was laughter in the crowd when he called Joe Biden the dumbest president in American history. So it's difficult to tell what the media contingent was compared to supporters who were in the room there. But we have a lot of questions about what's next for Donald Trump. He just got through the throes here of the verdicts. He's speaking to the American people today. Now what? The answer, by the way, will include a meeting with a probation officer And we want to bring in Jim Zirin, the former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, who's been awfully helpful with us through each stage of this trial. Is that the case, Jim? Will that be the next phase here for Donald Trump as his legal team cooks up an appeal?
Well, I think the next phase, you're absolutely right, is going to be an investigation by the probation department of the court. There'll be a report to the judge, and then the judge first is going to entertain motions to dismiss the case, which are pro forma motions and will undoubtedly be denied. The judge will impose sentence, and following the imposition of sentence, which I think is July 11th, the appellate process can begin.
Okay, so Jim, while that process is happening, can I just get a point of clarification? While all of that is underway, is Donald Trump still under the gag order? Because he seemed to suggest so during his news conference earlier today, yet also appeared to say a bunch of disparaging things about Michael Cohen, which theoretically could be in violation of the gag order. So where exactly does that stand here?
The gag order is still in place. He must not disparage the witnesses, court personnel, or the jurors. I think if he goes after the jurors, there'll be another citation for contempt in addition to the 20 or so citations that he now has. The judge seemed to be lenient with regard to disparagement of Michael Cohen. Where Cohen had attacked him, he had some sort of right of retort. So although he didn't identify Cohen by name, it was obvious he was talking about Cohen, called him a sleazebag, and he undoubtedly was advised or felt that he had a certain latitude in attacking Cohen, who's been on television attacking him.
Jim, we heard a lot about the trial itself from Donald Trump earlier, said it was very unfair. When the government wanted something, they got everything they wanted. We wanted a venue change. We didn't get it. I paid a lawyer, totally legal. He says it's a legal expense, not sheetrock. It's not construction. It's a legal expense. What would you say back to Donald Trump after what just transpired in court the last 7 weeks?
Well, tell me what legal services Cohen rendered. The jury believed Cohen. We have to accept that. And the expense was incurred to cloak in secrecy the payment to the porn star, Stormy Daniels, to cover up the tryst. No legal services were involved. This was arranged by Michael Cohen, and he was the fixer, the arranger, the enforcer for Donald Trump. And in fact, he went to jail over this very transaction because he was indicted for it in the federal court.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the fact that he was indicted and many other things came to light over the course of the trial, or certainly were made note of repeatedly. To go back to something else Joe was just talking about, though, in terms of what Donald Trump said this morning about what he perceived to be unfairness with the way all of this played out, he had a few specific assertions about what wasn't allowed to happen in the courtroom, what testimony could not be heard from certain witnesses that he wanted. Is any of that going to have merit in the appeal process?
I don't think so, and whatever he asserts in the appeal process, he'll have to back up with facts, which he hasn't done in this 33-minute rant you just heard at Trump Tower. It is not true that his witnesses were not permitted to testify. He wanted to call a campaign finance expert, and the judge allowed it, but narrowed the scope of what he was going to be allowed to testify about. And that's standard practice. The law had to come from the judge. It doesn't come from an expert. Otherwise, you'd have a battle of experts, and that would preempt what the jury is supposed to do.
Donald Trump also talked, Jim, about his decision, or at least what we thought was his decision to not testify. He said, "I would have testified." This is a quote. "I wanted to testify. The theory is, though, you never testify, but I would have loved to." What would have happened if he chose to testify? in his own defense.
I think if he had taken the stand, number one, he would have been cross-examined on the substance of the transaction and his role in the transaction. And there, he would have had to admit his role, which was a contested issue in the case, or he would have been faced with further charges of perjury. Secondly, the judge did allow limited cross-examination. He made that in response to a motion that is always made at the beginning of the trial. And he said there were certain areas that the prosecutor could go into if Trump took the stand, and certain which had bearing on credibility. And there were other areas he was not going to allow the prosecutor to go into. So there's this so-called biased judge making rulings in favor of Trump.
Well, and certainly the biased judge or the corrupt judge, to use whatever language that Donald Trump has been using to describe Juan Merchan, as well as the idea that this was, as he repeatedly has said, a Soros-funded district attorney in Alvin Bragg, the idea that all of this was brought upon him for political reasons. I feel like it's worth just making it clear, though, Jim, even if that were true, if these charges should never have been brought, as Trump and many other Republicans have said, the fact that a jury found enough merit in the evidence to convict him in all 34 counts, should that then therefore essentially make moot that entire point? Because even if you question the motive of these charges being brought, ultimately 12 everyday Americans that the defense agreed could serve as adequate jurors decided Trump was guilty of these crimes.
Well, in the first place, the charges were brought by a grand jury in New York County. We don't know how many of those grand jurors, I suppose there were 23 of them, were Republicans. We don't know how many of them liked Trump. We just don't know what their biases and prejudices were. They have said again and again and perpetuated the lie that Bragg ran for office on a platform of getting Donald Trump. That's not true. In fact, he avoided discussing the Trump case when he was running in the primaries, and he got the Democratic nomination, and which is tantamount to election. So you cannot say that Bragg brought these charges because he was a biased prosecutor determined to get Trump, or he was fulfilling a campaign promise. Letitia James, the Attorney General, did run for office on a promise she was going to get Trump, but that's a different question. Bragg, I think, showed tremendous courage here. He's been a great district attorney. Crime is down, contrary to what Trump says. And Bragg was very reluctant to bring these charges until they were totally vetted and investigated. In fact, the fraud charges, which were the subject of a civil case that Letitia James brought against Trump, were not brought by Alvin Bragg. He declined on those charges. He went with these charges because he believed that this would lead to a successful prosecution. He was vilified. He was called a racist. He was attacked, and he went ahead. He's really a profile in courage. And the case went to before a judge in a court of law, and it was presented to a jury, and the jury unanimously convicted. And Bragg is completely vindicated.
Well, lastly, Jim, you know it's our job to ask you what you think is going to happen at sentencing. Is Donald Trump, are we to believe, going to be slicing garlic at Rikers Island?
I think it's entirely possible because in sentencing, the judge takes into account a number of factors. There is the factor of Trump's age. He's 77 years old. That's in his favor. Unlikely to sentence a 77-year-old man to jail. Trump, even in his press conference, spoke about his age, and then realizing that he used that weapon against Joe Biden, he sort of pulled away from it. There's the point that Trump has never been convicted of anything. Well, he's never been convicted of anything because he's managed to delay the 3 other trials that would be had against him in the federal, 2 in the federal court and 1 in Illinois. What would be against him is the panoply of civil cases where he's been found liable, including the E. Jean Carroll case, where He was adjudicated a sexual abuser, where he defamed a woman without any basis whatsoever. And the civil fraud case, where a judgment was entered against him for $500 million. So those are factors which would militate in favor of a jail sentence, plus the fact that Trump is a public figure, and he's a public figure who engaged in a corrupt and illegal act in order to win the 2016 election. And when a public figure engages in conduct like that, judges like to make an example of them, because it will deter such conduct in the future, either on his part or the part of other people who are seeking public office.
All right, Jim Zirin, it's always great to get your perspective. You've been with us through the very beginning, and it's great to have you back now that this has reached a conclusion, although the appeals process still needs to play out. Jim Zirin, former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, we appreciate your time. And now we want to consider the political ramifications here and bring in our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, as we said at the top of the show, Donald Trump so far has raised more than $30 million in the aftermath of this verdict. Is he winning this right now?
Well, I think he's taking advantage of it. I'd say that. This is a long-haul campaign. It only matters what happens in November. And so if he takes in, $35 million, but he scares away a few 100,000 potential voters for himself, which he needs to be able to compete in these states, it'll be a bad trade. All the money in the world can't buy you votes. And so the reality is we don't know what net effect this will have on the voters, but we have seen things like this week's Marist poll, which indicates 17% of his vote would be considered up for grabs potentially if he has a conviction. Now, we know he has a conviction, so we'll start to see polling data come in based on that that'll tell us whether or not this is going to hurt him at the ballot box.
Jeannie, we heard Donald Trump talk about Joe Biden today. Said he was the dumbest president we ever had. There was laughter in the crowd. Called him a Manchurian candidate. What does Joe Biden do now?
He's got to keep reminding people that this is a convicted felon. He's got to keep reminding people that nobody's above the law, even a former president, that he was convicted by a jury of his peers. And he's got to use his bully pulpit to explain to people what Donald Trump was found guilty of. So he's got some work to do, but most importantly, he's got to do the work of the American public as it pertains to the economy, immigration, the border, foreign policy. And to his credit, that's what he's been doing while Donald Trump has been in Manhattan fighting off these charges as a convicted felon. So I think he can do it, but he has to make sure he focuses on the issues of concern to the people, all the while explaining what their choice is between him, age and all, and a convicted felon.
Yeah. Our great panel with us today, this day after the verdict, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis will have much more time to take a deeper dive with our signature panel coming up as we also wait to hear from President Biden. This is a late ad. The president set to deliver remarks on the Middle East, according to the guidance from the White House, and that could come at any time. We'll keep tabs on that for you as well here on the fastest show in politics. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow very close to session highs, advancing 150 points right now, a gain of 0.4%. S&P back above 5,200, 52.12 right now. It is lower by 23 points, down by almost 0.5%. NASDAQ is down 206. A drop there of 1.2%. A sell-off in the world's largest tech companies is dragging down stocks. 10-year yield right now 4.51%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.89%. Spot gold is down $13 the ounce, down 0.6%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil also lower today, with WTI 77.23, a drop right now of just about 0.8%. Hess shareholders have approved the company's proposal to be acquired by Chevron for $53 billion by a razor-thin majority of 51% of shares outstanding. Chevron shares, they're advancing today on that news. Chevron up 1.1%, Hess Corp up by 1.6%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Indeed, I am Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons this day after, with so many questions about the legal process that Donald Trump is facing, but also the political implications of this historic conviction. And it's something we talked to Jim Clyburn about last evening, Kaylee, and this had just taken place with questions that, as we were just discussing with Jeannie Shanzana, and we'll get into this more in a minute. What's the reaction from Joe Biden here? Do you just let Donald Trump go through this, speak for himself, carry the guilty headline that's on the front of every newspaper this morning, or do you go on the road and remind people of this and get into what it means? Jim Clyburn has his own take on it. The congressman had this to say.
I don't think so. Maintaining this democracy is not a partisan issue. It's not Democrats or Republicans. This country has been served well by this two-party system, sometimes to my liking, sometimes not so much. But I think all of us are responsible for this. And I get a little irritated when I hear people say Democrats, to keep this democracy, Democrats need to do this, or Democrats need to do the other. Americans need to work together to maintain this democracy and let the judicial system take care of itself.
That was Congressman Jim Clyburn, the Democrat from South Carolina, speaking with us yesterday, last evening on Balance of Power. We go now back to our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, we just got the 2-minute warning from the White House that President Biden is about to give remarks about the Middle East. Would it be wise for him first to address the verdict of yesterday?
I think he should. There's a lot of debate on this. I think he should address it, and then I think he should move on and talk about the hostages, number one, talk about the issues going on in the Middle East and his policy. But I do think he should address it because we're living in a universe where, depending on which station you turn to, you are getting a very different perspective on what happened yesterday. And so it can't be said enough that the president has got to make the case of the choice that the people of the United States have before them in November. So, yes, I think he should.
Rick, we may have less than a minute before Joe Biden hits the podium here, and we'd love to hear from you when he's done. Does he address this verdict today?
I don't know if he wants to put this ahead of his Middle East issues. Depends on what he's going to talk about. If he's got some news to break, that would certainly transcend anything he wants to remark about this. I would say, though, that they are playing two different games. I mean, the rules that Donald Trump is abiding by, or lack thereof, are significantly different than the way the Democrats are handling this. And at some point, I think the Democrats have to look inward and say, if we don't start playing by a little more aggressive rules, Trump's going to dictate this entire campaign. So far, he has. So I think Democrats have to, calibrate this and say, we have to start pushing back. We got to push back hard because we're running out of time.
Well, and I just wonder, considering we did have that rather rambling at times remarks from President Trump, former President Trump, at Trump Tower earlier this morning, if you're the campaign, can you really let that go unanswered on tape, Jeannie? Do you have to have something that can circulate along with the sound bites of Donald Trump that are circulating today?
I absolutely think so. You have got to respond in this environment. It's not the way he wants to do business, meaning President Biden. He'd prefer a more traditional campaign, but this is the campaign and this is the opponent he has. And he is going to have to very quickly move forward because as we look at these polls, time is running out for this Democratic Party to ensure that they can win in these swing states. So I do think you have to respond to both Donald Trump's remarks today, to the names that Joe Biden was called, including Manchurian candidate, and to the importance of the rule of law. This is a convicted felon. The jury of his peers did their business, and nobody is above the law, including a former president and including, quite frankly, Joe Biden or his son, who starts a trial next week. So he's going to have to keep making that case ad nauseum over and over.
If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, welcome. Balance of Power is live from Washington as we wait to hear now from President Biden. The White House adding a late addition to his schedule today, an updated guidance that will include now remarks on the Middle East. That's all that we have heard as the state dining room is dressed up. The press pool is in the room, and we'll be hearing him speak momentarily as we spend time with our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Rick, where do you think he's going today on the Middle East? We've just seen a change in policy in Ukraine that we were discussing earlier, with the president allowing now U.S. weapons to be used in some limited areas by Ukraine in an offensive manner against Russia. Is he making news on Israel here?
Yeah, I would think if they've told you already that it's going to be on the Middle East, it could be potentially breakthroughs between the accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I know the administration has been working very hard. Secretary Blinken has been doing shuttle diplomacy, and so maybe that's one of the
Looks
positive
like he's out
things
here now. Let's listen to Joe Biden live on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Before I begin my remarks, I just want to say a few words about what happened yesterday in New York City. The American principle that no one is above the law was reaffirmed. Donald Trump was given every opportunity to defend himself. It was a state case, not a federal case, and it was heard by a jury of 12 citizens, 12 Americans, 12 people like you, like millions of Americans who served on juries. This jury is chosen the same way every jury in America is chosen. It was a process that Donald Trump's attorney was part of. The jury heard 5 weeks of evidence. 5 weeks. And after careful deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. They found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts. Now he'll be given the opportunity, as he should, to appeal that decision just like everyone else has that opportunity. That's how the American system of justice works. And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. Our justice system has endured for nearly 250 years, and it literally is the cornerstone of America, our justice system. The justice system should be respected, and we should never allow anyone to tear it down. It's as simple as that. That's America. That's who we are. And that's who we'll always be, God willing. Now to another issue. I want to give an update on my efforts to end the crisis in Gaza. For the past several months, my negotiators of foreign policy, intelligence community, and like have been relentlessly focused, not just on a ceasefire that would inevitably be fragile and temporary, but on a durable end of the war. That's been the focus, a durable end of this war. One that brings all the hostages home, ensures Israel's security, creates a better day after in Gaza without Hamas in power, and sets the stage for a political settlement that provides a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Now, after intensive diplomacy carried out by my team, my many conversations with leaders of Israel, Qatar, and Egypt, and other Middle Eastern countries, Israel has offered a comprehensive new proposal. It's a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the release of all hostages. This proposal has been transmitted by Qatar to Hamas. Today, I want to lay out its terms for the American citizens and for the world. This new proposal has 3 phases. 3. The first phase would last for 6 weeks. Here's what it would include: a full and complete ceasefire, a withdrawal of Israeli forces from all populated areas of Gaza, release of a number of hostages, including women, the elderly, the wounded, in exchange for the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. There are American hostages who would be released at this stage, and we want them home. Additional, some remains of hostages who have been killed would be returned to their families, bringing some degree of closure to that terrible grief. Palestinians, civilians would return to their homes and neighborhoods in all areas of Gaza, including in the north. Humanitarian assistance would surge, with 600 trucks carrying aid into Gaza every single day. With the ceasefire, that aid could be safely and effectively distributed to all who need it. Hundreds of thousands of temporary shelters, including housing units, would be delivered by the international community. All that and more would begin immediately. During the 6 weeks of phase 1, Israel and Hamas would negotiate the necessary arrangements to get to phase 2, which is a permanent end to hostilities. Now, I'll be straight with you. There are a number of details to negotiate to move from phase 1 to phase 2. Israel will want to make sure its interests are protected. But the proposal says if the negotiations take longer than 6 weeks for phase 1, the ceasefire will still continue as long as negotiations continue. In the United States, Egypt, and Qatar would work to ensure negotiations keep going. All agreements, until all the agreements are reached and phase 2 is able to begin. Then phase 2, there'd be an exchange for the release of all remaining living hostages, including male soldiers. Israeli forces would withdraw from Gaza, and as long as Hamas lives up to its commitments, a temporary ceasefire would become, in the words of the Israeli proposal, the cessation of hostilities permanently, end of quote. Cessation of hostilities permanently. Finally, in phase 3, a major reconstruction plan for Gaza would commence, and any final remains of hostages who've been killed would be returned to their families. That's the offer that's now on the table, and what we've been asking for. It's what we need. The people of Israel should know they can make this offer without any further risk to their own security because they've devastated Hamas forces over the past 8 months. At this point, Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7th, which is one of the Israelis' main objectives in this war, and quite frankly, a righteous one. I know there are those in Israel who will not agree with this plan and will call for the war to continue indefinitely. Some are even in the government coalition. And they've made it clear they want to occupy Gaza, they want to keep fighting for years, and the hostages are not a priority to them. Well, I've urged the leadership in Israel to stand behind this deal, despite whatever pressure comes. And to the people of Israel, let me say this. As someone who's had a lifelong commitment to Israel, as the only American president who's ever gone to Israel in a time of war, as someone who just sent the U.S. forces to directly defend Israel when it was attacked by Iran, I ask you to take a step back and think what will happen if this moment is lost. We can't lose this moment. Indefinite war in pursuit of an unidentified notion of total victory will not bring Israel, will only bog down Israel and Gaza, draining the economic, military, and human resources, and furthering Israel's isolation in the world. That will not bring hostages home. That will not bring an enduring defeat of Hamas. That will not bring Israel lasting security. But a comprehensive approach that starts with this deal will bring hostages home and will lead to more secure Israel. And once a ceasefire and hostage deal is concluded, it unlocks the possibility of a great deal more progress, including calm along Israel's northern border with Lebanon. The United States will help forge a diplomatic resolution, one that ensures Israel's security and allows people to safely return to their homes without fear of being attacked. With the deal, a rebuilding of Gaza will begin. Arab nations and the international community, along with Palestinian and Israeli leaders, to get it done in a manner that does not allow Hamas to rearm. And the United States will work with our partners to rebuild homes, schools, and hospitals in Gaza, to help repair communities that were destroyed in the chaos of war. And with this deal, Israel could become more deeply integrated in the region, including, it's no surprise to you all, including potential historic normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. Israel could be part of a regional security network to counter the threat posed by Iran. All this progress would make Israel more secure, with Israeli families no longer living in the shadow of a terrorist attack. And all this would create the conditions for a different future, and a better future for the Palestinian people. One of self-determination, dignity, security, and freedom. This path is available once the deal is struck. Israel will always have the right to defend itself against the threats to its security and to bring those responsible October 7th to justice. And the United States will always ensure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself. If Hamas fails to fulfill its commitments under the deal, Israel can resume military operations. But Egypt and Qatar have assured me, and they are continuing to work to ensure that Hamas doesn't do that. The United States will help ensure that Israel lives up to their obligations as well. That's what this deal says. That's what it says. And we'll do our part. This is truly a decisive moment. Israel has made their proposal. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it. Hamas needs to take the deal. For months, people all over the world have called for a ceasefire. Now it's time to raise your voices and demand that Hamas come to the table, agrees to this deal, and end this war that they began. Of course, there'll be differences on the specific details that need to be worked out. That's natural. If Hamas comes to negotiate ready to deal, then Israel negotiations must be given a mandate, the necessary flexibility to close that deal. The past 8 months have marked heartbreaking pain. Pain of those whose loved ones are slaughtered by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. Hostages and their families waiting in anguish. Ordinary Israelis whose lives were forever marked by the shattering event of Hamas's sexual violence and ruthless brutality. And the Palestinian people have endured sheer hell in this war. Too many innocent people have been killed, including thousands of children. Far too many have been badly wounded. We all saw the terrible images from the deadly fire in Rafah earlier this week, following an Israeli strike against targeting Hamas. And even as we work to surge assistance to Gaza, with 1,800 trucks delivering supplies these last 5 days, 1,800, the humanitarian crisis still remains. I know this is a subject on which people in this country feel deep, passionate convictions, and so do I. This has been one of the hardest, most complicated problems in the world. There's nothing easy about this, nothing easy about it. Through it all, though, the United States has worked relentlessly to support Israeli security, to get humanitarian supplies into Gaza, to get a ceasefire and a hostage deal to bring this war to an end. Yesterday, with this new initiative, we've taken an important step in that direction. I want to level with you today. as to where we are and what might be possible. But I need your help. Everyone who wants peace now must raise their voices and let the leaders know they should take this deal, work to make it real, make it lasting, and forge a better future out of the tragic terror attack and war. It's time to begin this new stage, for the hostages to come home, for Israel to be secure, for the suffering to stop. It's time for this war to end, for the day after to begin. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, can you tell us, sir, Donald Trump refers to himself as a political prisoner and blames you directly. What's your response to that, sir? Do you think the conviction will have an impact on the campaign? We'd love to hear your thoughts, sir.
Should he be on the ballot, sir?
President Biden not answering questions shouted at him by reporters about Donald Trump's conviction yesterday, although he did, in those remarks from the state dining room at the White House, address what happened yesterday, saying that it shows the American principle that no one is above the law, that was reaffirmed. He noted that it was a state case, not a federal case, heard by a jury of 12 citizens. And he said that's how the American system of justice works, going on to say it would be reckless and dangerous and irresponsible for anyone to say that this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. But of course, it was then followed by pretty remarkable remarks on the Middle East. The president, Joe, announcing an Israeli offer, a comprehensive new proposal, to use his words, and a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and release of all hostages that has been transmitted through Qatar to Hamas. 3 phases here. The first is a temporary ceasefire that would last 6 weeks. Phase 2 would be a permanent end to hostilities. And the president said if negotiations for that second phase take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue until phase 2 is allowed to begin.
Yeah, this was an important moment here, Kaylee. 3 phases that would include the exchange of all remaining living hostages, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. We want to assemble our panel to get their take on this. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, on a day we thought we'd be talking about Donald Trump's legal future. And in part, we are with the remarks here. I'm going to start there with you both. Going into this news conference, we were asking you, or this set of remarks by the president, if you thought he would or should address the case in New York. Jeannie, that is exactly where he began. Time well spent?
It absolutely was. And his tone was absolutely right. As Kaylee just went through, he talked about the fact that he was judged by a jury of his peers at the state level, that this is the reality in the United States, that nobody is above the law. And the fact is, Donald Trump can appeal this decision. But I think one of the most important things I heard was when he said it is irresponsible for anybody to be talking about this decision as rigged and to try to delegitimize our judiciary. And that is something we've heard not just from Donald Trump, but from the other leaders of the Republican Party, right up to the highest elected official, Mike Johnson, to Governor Reynolds, to Lindsey Graham, to Marco Rubio. I mean, the list goes on and on. It is irresponsible. And when, the former governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, came out yesterday and he said that the reality is that we should respect the decision. He was warned by the Trump campaign that his election bid for the Senate is over. So the president was right on that, and his remarks were on point.
Rick, we'll get to what he said actually about the proposal that Israel has put on the table here. But first, do you agree with Jeannie's characterization? Did he strike the right tone here?
Yeah, it certainly created a pretty stark contrast to what Donald Trump did at the Trump Tower today with, this rambling 1-hour diatribe about grievances. So, makes a good contrast, and I think did the basic minimum that he could do. I would hope that Democrats would fan out now and really go on the offensive, because we've seen this act before. After Bill Clinton and the Starr report, he went in and really defined it, and Republicans got on defense. And so this is exactly the opposite from a partisan nature, but I think the Biden folks are going to have to go out and do more than he did today.
Let's talk about this proposal. We should make clear this has not been accepted. What we just heard has been transmitted, as the president told us, by Qatar to Hamas. But, Jeannie, there are progressive Democrats who have been waiting for some news here, and a Biden White House and campaign looking for a breakthrough. We just heard the details, again, summarized by Kayleigh: a complete ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli forces, release of hostages, living hostages, and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Does this sound like a breakthrough moment to you?
You know, I hope it is. You know, it is really hard to tell. While the president was talking, I was thinking about the fact that the Middle East, going all the way back to Richard Nixon, if not before, has been really a stumbling block for American presidents, left, right, and center, Republican and Democrat, from Richard Nixon all the way through. And so, you know, this is very tough. The president said that. We all want to see a breakthrough. I think his tone is right, but I think it is very, very early to declare something a breakthrough. You know, it's very hard to trust Hamas. It's very hard to know what they will do. We're talking about a 6-week temporary ceasefire in phase 1 and a permanent ceasefire in phase 2. That would be an amazing step forward, but hard to say we're there at this point. But I give the president and his team, including the CIA director and the Secretary of State, you know, a lot of credit for working on this, and Qatar for working at it as it has in terms of being a middleman or state, if you will, to try to make progress on this. It is so much needed. And the remarks about the hostages, I think that's where all of our minds should be. They have been suffering there for far too long.
Well, Rick, the president essentially said that this deal is on the table, that Hamas says it wants a ceasefire, and he says this deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it, seemingly addressing those words at Hamas. Also, though, seeming to speak to a domestic audience. He said everyone who wants peace now must raise their voices, suggesting they need to be pressuring Hamas to accept the terms of this agreement. Does this help him domestically with those people at home who have been pleading for peace now?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty smooth move on the president's part. I mean, this is a Israeli offer, looks really generous and reasonable. And I would say most people don't think of the Israeli position on this as being generous or reasonable lately. And he's putting it all on Hamas now. And I thought what was really interesting about his comments is he said that Israel has accomplished its goal, which was to devastate Hamas and basically take them out as a entity. And that's the first I've heard of that being determined. Israel, I don't think, has actually articulated that themselves. So all this becomes available now that Hamas has been devastated. And now all this is on the desk of the Hamas leadership. And I think it was pretty interesting negotiating strategy for the president to go out and use the bully pulpit in the United States to put all the heat now on Hamas. If this fails, it's Hamas only. Anybody who wants to criticize Joe Biden, all he can say is, hey, we put this deal on that would end the hostilities for good, and Hamas didn't take it. It's all on Hamas. So I like it. I think it's an appropriate way to use the presidency. And, you know, now we look like we're part of the campaign to get Hamas to do the right thing. Hopefully it works out, because it's better for everybody if it does.
Remarkable timing this day after the Trump verdict, and thanks to our great panel for staying overtime to help us understand what we just heard, the implications here at home and globally. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg's signature political panel here. We'll have more with Rick and Jeannie in the late edition of Balance of Power that starts at 5 p.m. Washington time, as we add the voice, pick the brain of Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security team here in Washington. A breaker that not everyone saw coming today. This is a late ad on the president's schedule. What do you make of the timing and what we just heard?
Well, you know, obviously the timing is pretty interesting. I think you're seeing a president who wants to put the focus very much back on policy, and it's also an element of deflection a little bit. He wants to put the pressure on Hamas. He also wants to make a clear show to folks back home, both Republicans and Democrats, progressives, kids on college campuses who have been protesting all through the spring. He is in the thick of this. He is pressing for a solution and essentially saying, listen, this is our best chance right now.
Well, best chance doesn't necessarily mean a guaranteed outcome.
Right.
Israel has made a proposal. In the past, Israel has not accepted proposals Hamas has made. So if this is now in the hands of Hamas, how likely is it that they're going to readily agree to this?
Well, that is the question. But the other question I also have is, how genuine is this proposal? I mean, it was only a couple days ago that Israel said we're going to need at least another 7 months to keep going after Hamas. So what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made clear is they do not want a situation where Hamas remains in operation. So how can you do a ceasefire with an entity that you say you are determined not to let exist? And Israel so far has just not answered that question.
Palestinian civilians would return to their homes, he says, including in the north, under phase 1. This, I presume, would resonate in Gaza. What would be the impact for Joe Biden's image on that side?
Well, I mean, I think what you're seeing here is a president who is trying to walk a very fine line between the pressure from those who support Israel, which is a significant portion of the Democratic Party and also among Republicans, but the very vocal wing, increasingly vocal wing of the Democratic Party that believe he needs to do a lot more to help Gazans. So when he's saying things like that, people will be allowed to return home, he is making an explicit plea and sending an explicit message to those progressives who really feel that he has not done enough to support the people of Gaza.
And this is all coming directly from President Biden himself. What should we make of, Nick, that this was announced not by Israel, not by Qatar or Egypt, who have served as mediators? Hamas didn't say it had received this proposal. President Biden is where we heard this from.
Well, I mean, I think what we've had a lot happening in the shadows. The broad outlines of this proposal were not a huge surprise. We had known about this idea of a phased approach. Some of the specifics were new, specifically on the number of humanitarian trucks with humanitarian aid that would go in, some of the details of the release. But all of that, I mean, is essentially, he acknowledged, is still stuff that needs to be worked out. But I think what you're seeing is a president who has had a CIA director over in the region, of quietly pushing for, trying to get these talks going and trying to just inject more momentum to say, listen, amid everything that's going on, Israeli troops in Rafah, the campaign continues. We have a possibility for a pause in the fighting, and he's really sending that message to both sides to show that he's right in the thick of this.
Does a ceasefire, if this is accepted, a complete ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, keep the ICC from pursuing the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, I mean, it would certainly help defuse some of the tension there. But, the ICC prosecutor is making his case based on evidence that they have accumulated in the past.
Already committed.
That's been already committed. I mean, he is coming under a lot of pressure right now. I mean, they are seeking those warrants. The arrest warrants have not been issued. That is a huge focus for the U.S. and Israel. But certainly, if there is a ceasefire, it gives them another case to make.
Yeah.
All right, Nick Wadhams, who leads our U.S. National Security Team here at Bloomberg, thank you for running into the studio for us after we had this 3-phase plan outlined by President Biden. The onus is now on Hamas to accept it. And of course, this comes the day after Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. A lot of news here in Washington. Joe and I will have more coverage for it at 5 p.m. right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very happy Friday, everybody. Good afternoon, live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this. Yes, did you guess? It's Friday, May 31st. We're getting ready to wrap up the month of May here.
We certainly are. And some numbers for the month of May, Carol. The S&P 500 lower today, but on track for a 3.6% gain. Treasury's headed toward their best month this year. That does follow a key inflation read that came in line with estimates. We got that earlier today. We're going to have more on the trade in just a moment.
I feel like investors were like, it didn't come in worse than expected. All right, we're going to talk about that.
Those are expectations now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like if it comes in worse than expected, then, you know, there's an overreaction.
Yeah, you're worried about, okay, Fed higher for longer, or could they even possibly raise rates? All right, having said that, our focus, no surprise, folks, is on the world of politics. Former President Donald Trump is guilty in the hush money case. You know that. Now what? From sentencing and jail time to appeals, running for re-election and pardoning himself, we've got it all covered, and we've got some of the answers to those questions.
Plus, our own Tim O'Brien has faced off in court against Donald Trump. Tim's going to join us and tell us about the most critical verdict, which is still yet to come.
Yes, and also chip diplomacy or war, we ask. Increasingly, it looks like the latter when it comes to the global semiconductor race. The CEO of the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy weighs in, also a former official in the State Department during the Trump administration, so we'll see what she has to say.
Okay, shares of Dell down by 20% right now. Software blow-ups, a canary in the coal mine. We'll see a little bit later.
Yeah, lots to come in the next 60 minutes. First up, though, let's get to that trading day and a look at your top business stories. Here is Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, and a happy Friday to the two of you. We are looking at a decidedly mixed market right now. Big gains for the Dow, best level of the day, up 220 right now, up by about 0.6%. S&P does remain in the red, down 20 at 52.15, was trading below 5,200, down now by about 0.4%. The Nasdaq Composite Index under extreme pressure today, down 207, a drop right now of 1.2%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.50% with a 2-year 4.88%. Spot gold is declining 0.7%, 23.25 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil WTI down now by 1%. Carol mentioned Dell. It is plunging by 19%, the most in 4 years, after its first revenue increase since 2022 was not enough to impress investors. Again, we've got Dell right now down by 19.4%. Gap higher after reporting better than expected results and raising its outlook for the full year. Gap shares, they are jumping now by 26.9%. At a headline off the Bloomberg Professional Service, Google is conducting sweeping layoffs in its cloud unit, that according to Insider. Again, recapping, the Dow higher, S&P, NASDAQ both very much in the red. S&P right now down 19, drop there of 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, got it, Charlie. Thank you so much. Donald Trump now, the first former president to be found guilty of crimes in a historic verdict. The jury taking just 2 days to find him guilty of all 34 counts. You know that, though there are still lots of questions that remain, from sentencing and jail time to appeals, which is expected based on comments from Donald Trump this morning, to running for re-election and pardoning himself. Bloomberg News legal reporter Patricia Hurtado has been in the courtroom. She has been there when the verdict was announced. She joins us right now in New York City. Patricia, great to have you here. We have a bunch of questions we want to go through. A great story from you on the Bloomberg today. But first up, as the verdict was read last night, tell us what was happening inside the courtroom.
Well, it was kind of stunning because originally we thought we were going home for the end of the day, and the jury did not have a verdict. Suddenly, the judge retook the bench. He was going to dismiss them at 4:30, and they came back at 4:15 and said, or 4:20, and said, we have a verdict, and the jury wants to fill it out, so we'll be doing it in 50 minutes. So we all sat there pensively waiting and anxious. And then when the verdict was announced, it was kind of stunning because I did not expect every single count, but it was 34 guilty counts.
Just pretty remarkable to hear. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and a gasp went through the courtroom, and people were like, oh, my God. And then as it gets guilty, it became clear Trump was very stone-faced, but you could tell he was clenching his jaw, and it was fury on his face.
Absolutely stunning, and certainly a historic moment for you to witness, and we appreciate you sharing your observations with us. Now that the verdict has been reached, and the former president does await sentencing, that happens on the 11th of July. What do observers say, Patricia, right now about the possibility of prison time, or what the judge could hand down as a sentence?
Well, it ranges the gamut from the sentencing range for each count is 1 1/3 to 4. Most experts do not think that there'll be 34 years in prison, for example, or more than anything. You know, it's a maximum of 4 years on one count. Most people do not think he would get at least 4 years of imprisonment, and maybe the judge would fashion some kind of sentence that would mean 6 months of home detention or 6 months in jail instead of prison, and then 6 months of probation. It's unclear, but this is a judge who's already been angered because Trump has basically crossed the line several times and violated his gag order, and is also not shown any remorse. So while he may be a first-time offender who's over 70 years old, it means that he may have to take into consideration this is a guy who's not remorseful.
Did he cross the line this morning, President Trump, former President Donald Trump, in his press conference?
He came, it seemed, very close to condemning witnesses he's not supposed to, but I guess he said he's under a gag order, so that's why he didn't name Michael Cohen while talking about Michael Cohen. That's a little...
He is expected to appeal, though, right? And he made that comment this morning as well.
Yes, and he's already appealed to the Court of Appeals, Judge Merchan's decision on the gag orders anyway. So that's been pending since last week. It's all got to go through the process. I talked to a couple of legal experts, and they're not even sure, although the gag was supposed to expire after the trial is over. Some say the trial's technically not over until he gets sentenced, so the gag may still be in place. And maybe Trump was trying to make sure he didn't cross that line once more by accident.
So, Patricia, how does the former president and current frontrunner for the Republican nomination continue to run for president with the overhang of the appeal, a potential violation of a gag order, and the sentencing hanging over his head?
Well, it seems shocking, but there's nothing in our U.S. Constitution that prohibits anybody who's convicted of a crime from running for office and even getting elected. So that's one issue. Trump also can't pardon himself in the state charges. He can only do that in federal court. So it remains to be seen whether Merchan will actually sentence him in July or postpone his having to serve a sentence till after he's through, if he wins re-election, maybe down the line, years from now, after he finishes, if he gets a second term. So this is all kind of many unknowables.
Yeah, we are in new territory. Can he vote for himself? Can he be president from a jail cell?
Yes, he can be president from a jail cell, from the experts I spoke to. Whether he will get sent to jail, this is the only case that will probably be done and over with before the election. And he can also possibly vote under Florida law. Although it seems like you're not allowed to vote if you're a convicted felon, apparently the Florida law can be interpreted to look to the state where the person got convicted. So in Trump's case, it's New York state law, and New York state allows former convicts to vote.
Well,
so, especially if he doesn't go to jail.
Well, you've been a rock star, the whole legal team here and reporting team here at Bloomberg, just keeping us up to date on what's been going on in downtown Manhattan. Patricia, thank you so much. Our thanks to Bloomberg News legal reporter Patricia Hurtado. That's a rundown of what's at stake and what could happen next. One thing that did happen, according to Donald Trump in his press conference this morning, supporters are sending in cash.
Last night, we just got a report this morning. In the history of politics, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody will find that I'm wrong, maybe, but I don't think so. They raised with small money donors, meaning like $21, $42, $53, $38, a record $39 million in about a 10-hour period.
All right, everybody. Donald Trump this morning in his press conference from Trump Tower. So supporters sending in cash. Maybe more interesting in that statement is Donald Trump saying, quote, in the history of politics, I believe maybe I'm wrong. Somebody will find that I am wrong.
Which brings us to a column by Bloomberg Opinion senior executive editor Tim O'Brien. Tim writes today how Donald Trump has spent decades circumventing and flouting civil and civic society. He spent his presidency and the years since going well out of his way to undermine the rule of law, and the law finally caught up to him. And yet, a more critical verdict is still to come. We welcome in Bloomberg Opinion senior executive editor Tim O'Brien. His books include Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. Tim also faced off with the former president in a lawsuit that went in Tim's favor. Tim, by the way, talked with Trump for that book. Tim joins us here in the studio. You've tracked the former president for years, Tim, way back before he was even thinking about the White House. Many have talked about his ability to fight and win legal battles for a long time. You write it was long overdue for the law to finally win. Does it mean anything, though?
Oh, I think it means a lot of things. I mean, I think we're a nation of laws. Laws exist because all of us can be prone to bad behavior, even you, Tim. And I think, and I think they enforce standards of civil and civic society. And I think Trump's never been brought into a courtroom with these kind of stakes before. Bob Mueller investigated him, but Bob Mueller chose not to bring him into a court of law. He said, I'll let the U.S. attorney handle it, or I'll let Congress handle it. He was impeached twice, but the Senate decided not to try him. And he got tried on the facts here. And there's 3 remaining criminal cases looming out there that are very muscular and substantial. Much more, in fact, than this case. I think this case was the weakest of the 4 criminal cases brought against him. So I think it matters that it's on a very basic level, rules and laws matter. He was judged by a jury of his peers, 2 of whom were lawyers. I think Justice Merchan ran an impeccable courtroom. I was in there for quite a bit of time, and he, under very challenging circumstances, he kept things moving along. And I think he got to a verdict that was built on a fact pattern. It wasn't a witch hunt. And it was clear as day. There were mountains of evidence that he was doctoring the company's books in order to mask payments to his former lovers to preserve his 2016 presidential bid. People can argue about whether or not those misdemeanors should have been elevated to felonies as part of the election interference charge, but the jury and the judge felt it did. Justice felt it did. And so we'll see where it goes from here.
Tim, you remind everybody you wrote about him, you had access to him, you had access to his business world and his financials, right? I'm just curious what you learned in talking to him and about his world and how he does things, and what impact losing this case essentially might have on him, the individual.
Yeah, I first began covering him 32 years ago. I was a research assistant on the first biography written about him, and I covered him at the Wall Street Journal and later at the New York Times, and now here at Bloomberg. And I've spent a lot of time with him. And I think he's a very different person now than he was even 2 years ago. I think he's aged quite a bit. I think he's worn down by this process. I think when the verdict was announced yesterday, I think he looked shell-shocked. And I think everyone was surprised by the rapidity with which the jury reached a verdict, the clarity of the verdict, and the fact that it was every single count. And on 9 of those counts, he signed the checks that are at the heart of those accounts. So I thought he would be held up for something. I didn't think it would go to all 34, yet it did. I think this weighs heavily on him. And he's in territory he has never been in before, Carol. Yeah. He's had run-ins with regulators in Atlantic City, with local government in New York. He's always weaponized the legal system against business and political opponents, members of the media. But this is the first time where he's really been held to account in a way that is potentially going to limit his liberty and circumscribe his future. And I think he is stunned and desperate.
And yet, there's a very good chance that come November, he could be president-elect.
Governing from a prison cell. And by the way, if he's in prison, if it were to come to that, the Secret Service would have to be accommodated. So you'd also have to have room at the prison for the Secret Service. The whole thing's mind-blowing were it to come to that.
You do think there's a good chance that the sentencing could include prison time?
I think there's a good chance. I think Justice Merchan is very circumspect. During the gag order rulings, he could have put Trump in jail. There were, 3 different hearings, I think, on that.
There are also 2 other individuals who have done jail time, right? I think about Michael Cohen and Mr. Weisselberg, right?
Yes.
That have related.
Who related all this, and I think Merchan wasn't going to put Trump in jail because he's a former president, because he didn't want to poison the atmosphere around the trial. But he now has at his disposal up to 4 years per charge. I don't think he's going to give Donald Trump 134 years in prison. You know, the most they would run concurrently, up to 4 years. I don't imagine he'll go that far. I do think he's going to be more severe than people anticipate. That's his record as a judge, particularly on white-collar crime, which we always ask of our judges in many cases is to be strict around the crimes. But this is an unusual case, we'll have to see.
How are you thinking about it politically? As you say, you know, the verdict, the final verdict may be to come, or the most important will come in November when people go to the polls. What does it mean? You know, we can go into history and American political history, but I do think about the supporters of Trump, which he highlighted today, saying they're sending in money. But how are you thinking about that?
Well, and he, you know, after he left the courtroom yesterday, he was the one who said, I was simply quoting him, you know, the real verdict will be November 5th when the people speak. And I think that's true. And I think if he ends up going to prison, I think even if he's on probation and he's got to go in every day, you know, for urine exams and get walked in and out of a courthouse and all the kind of demeaning things that happen when you're on probation, that is going to be detrimental to how he's seen in the eyes of the public. And this is not going to come down to blue voters or red voters and MAGA voters. It is going to come down to about 2 million voters in 7 states who are moderate to independent voters who I think care about institutions and the rule of law. And it'll be interesting to see what the impact this has on their view of him.
What I do find fascinating, Tim, and Amanda Gordon and Sri Natarajan write about this. We're going to be talking to Sri a little later about how wealthy Wall Street financiers who distanced themselves from President Trump following January 6th have now started again to rally around him. And you indeed have political opponents of the former president, like Nikki Haley, for example, who in recent weeks have
Marco Rubio
as well. We seem to be in a position where still he has support from the establishment, despite the fact that all of these challenges hang over his head.
Well, I think the calculus for the political camp is different than the calculus for the Wall Street or business camp. I think the political members of the Republican Party have recognized for some time that Donald Trump retains enormous momentum within the party, and that you have a very difficult time getting elected in the current Republican Party, at least in the primary season, unless you have Trump's support. I think what we're learning with the business community is I think they see all of politics as so shambolic and chaotic right now that they're wondering what are the public policy measures they want out of either a Democratic or a Republican administration. And it often boils down to very simplistic things: less regulation and lower taxes. And that sort of defines their imagination around what they want out of politicians. And unfortunately, it means that maybe they don't consider where we are vis-a-vis Ukraine, or how Gaza gets resolved, or how climate change gets addressed, or voting rights, or infrastructure spending that's good for the broader economy. I do think there's a real blinkered view of what politics entails, sometimes from the business community. And I think they should recognize whether or not they're playing with fire. Is Donald Trump ultimately going to be good for the economy? He's pursuing policies, or at least his campaign has articulated policies that are inflationary, that will add to an already large deficit. Those typically have not been issues conservative business people want to get behind.
These are concerns that LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman raised to us just a couple of weeks ago, who has been an opponent of President Trump's.
He has indeed. Tim, thank you so much. We
Thank
know
you,
a busy
Carol.
day for you. So
Always a
appreciate
pleasure.
it. Always a pleasure for us as well. Bloomberg Opinion Senior Executive Editor Tim O'Brien. Hey, still to come, what's fanning fears that the AI arms race is creating a new generation of winners and losers. That's coming up on Bloomberg Business Week. That's next.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, a tale of two very different markets. Today we have got the Dow surging, best level of the day right now, up 265 points, up by 0.7%. S&P lower at 52.19, was trading below that big round number, down 16 points right now, drop there of 0.3%. S&P, by the way, on track for a losing week. And we've got the NASDAQ Composite Index tumbling 211 as big tech sells off. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index down now by 1.3%. 10-year 4.50% with a 2-year 4.88%. Spot gold down $17 the ounce to $23.25, down 0.7%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.8%, $77.30 a barrel. Lots going on in the gaming industry. Sources tell Bloomberg Carl Icahn has amassed a sizable position in hotel and casino operator Caesars Entertainment. Caesars, by the way, the largest owner of casinos in the United States. Caesars shares, they're surging by 11.4%. And Penn Entertainment shares soaring after an activist investor called for the sale of the casino company. Penn Entertainment up 19.7%. Again, recapping a mixed Friday here with the S&P down 16, now dropped there of 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Charlie, talking certainly about this too and kind of what's going on in the market, certainly seeing kind of maybe a little bit of a rethink about winners and losers when it comes to AI. So first of all, Dell, shares plummeting after its first revenue increase since 2022 just wasn't enough to impress investors with high expectations for the company's AI server business. And then meantime, Tim, you've got, when it comes to the AI boom more generally, a stark divergence that is built up within the big tech complex, an index of software stocks in the red, while a gauge measuring chipmaker shares rallying more than 20%.
That gap reminding us that all AI investment roads may not lead to a payoff, at least not for now. Here with more, Bloomberg News equities reporter Ryan Blastelica in our Chicago bureau. Ryan, good to have you with us this afternoon. So walk us through this divergence that we're seeing right now with big tech, because for years we heard about software and services, the high margin businesses that were really eating the world, in the words of venture capitalist Mark Andreessen. But now it seems that what's actually eating the wallets of a lot of these tech companies is hardware and chips.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So yeah, absolutely. So far this year, we've really seen a lot more focus on the chip side of things and on the hardware side of things as companies start to build out the infrastructure that they need to start to incorporate AI services into their businesses and offerings. And that has really meant that as more companies spend there, they're not spending elsewhere. And right now, they're taking that money away from the sort of traditional software space. We saw Salesforce earlier this week. We saw Workday last week. We saw MongoDB just last night. All of these companies had sort of disappointing outlooks, sort of indicating that people aren't really doing big software deals right now. They're really focused elsewhere, and where their focus is really on the hardware side of things.
Well, it sounds like you, and we have too, have been talking to our Bloomberg Intelligence team, and is it simplistic, Ryan, as that, okay, as people are building out their AI needs, they are buying servers, they are buying lots of chips. I mean, just talk to NVIDIA, right? So that's the focus when it comes to capital expenditures, not on the software space, and that maybe the software spending, it's just being delayed, it's just being deferred, and that'll play catch up a little bit later on.
That seems to be the consensus, that this is sort of a temporary lull. Maybe we start to see a re-acceleration in growth as we get out to 2025. That's sort of the hope right now. Software is obviously very heavily intertwined with AI, and it is expected to benefit in a real substantial way over the long term. But we are in a position right now where the immediate spending needs and the CapEx is going, again, towards the hardware and the chip side of things. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. We did see Microsoft do very well. Of course, they have Azure, and they have their OpenAI investment. They are starting to integrate AI into their services. So they're probably the best example right now of one of the major software companies that is seeing an AI lift. On the smaller side, we saw C3.ai. They gave a pretty positive forecast, but again, that just sort of shows that if you're going to be spending right now, you're going to be spending on AI, and that's whether it's hardware or on the software side. The non-AI software is just not seeing the kind of demand that it used to be.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, I've got Zscaler as a gainer today. Now, that plays in the security space, so it's like it just depends. You've got to kind of really, Tim, check out your software names and really kind of understand what their exposure is, at least right now.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm glad you mentioned Microsoft, because I was going to say there is, Satya Nadella knocking at the door saying, hey, wait a second, we were up 60% last year. And although we're only up 7% this year, we're making a big play in AI right now. Okay, let's talk about some of the other companies, like Amazon, for example, you mentioned. But I'm also interested in like an Alphabet, the parent company of Google, because not a traditional software company by any means, an advertising company, but also one that's going hard on AI right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So Alphabet obviously has so many different ways that it's exploring AI. It's had that big conference not too long ago where it demonstrated all these new services it's going to be rolling out. There is a lot of interest there. That is one that's also considered a bit of a bargain relative to some of the other names, in the tech and software space. But also Alphabet does have its own cloud business, and that was a point of strength in its most recent report. That's one of the reasons that it's been doing so well. Amazon has been sort of weaker, at least over the immediate term, but of course, AWS is a major player in the cloud space, and that is one that's also been seeing pretty strong demand related to AI.
Yeah, Alphabet up about 22% so far in 2024. Amazon with about a 15% gain so far this year. Well, as we wrap up kind of earnings, Ryan, on the software companies, I mean, how did they do, and how did that compare with the semiconductor industry, if we kind of get down to earnings fundamentals?
Yeah, so on the sales side at least, I think about a little more than half of software companies beat expectations on revenue. That was a lot weaker than chip makers, where it was more around 70%. Both on earnings were pretty strong, but again, you've seen a lot of cost cutting and buybacks and stuff like that to help with the earnings side of things. But certainly in terms of revenue, it wasn't quite as strong on the software space, and that is just been reflected in the way the stocks have been performing so far this year.
Hey, Ryan, when we think about the software space, oftentimes, at least when we're talking about the hardware space, rather, we talk about it being cyclical, especially when it comes to the chips industry. The software industry, though, I'm wondering how cyclical this is. We're sort of in the early innings, I think many people would argue, when it comes to AI, but to what extent could we see a bounce back in spending on software after companies say, wait a second, we did buy all the servers and chips that we need?
Yeah, so I do think, as we see more companies roll out AI services, I do think, what people have said to me is that we maybe look for an acceleration in 2025. So definitely, sort of a cyclical business. We could see it pick up again over the longer term. Then I think, even on the contrary, I think once people stop building out their AI infrastructure, you could see a little bit of a deceleration on that side of things as well.
Hey, I do also wonder, as we've seen some pullback in some of these software names, what's the street saying? I mean, is this a buying opportunity? Because if we really believe that the software purchases are just deferred or delayed, some of these stocks have now, a 10 or 20% haircut. They're a lot cheaper than they were just a few days ago or a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I don't think anybody is really throwing their towel in on the sector. And I did see some research yesterday with people singling out names like ServiceNow as a name that looks like maybe a bit of a bargain following some weakness related to some of the other software blow-ups, kind of just dragging down the entire sector. So you'll certainly find, a lot of fans out there, a lot of bulls, a lot of people who think that over the longer term, especially as you start to see growth start to pick up again over the longer term, you will kind of maybe view this as a bit of a buying opportunity. It's certainly something that, that's certainly not a minority view on Wall Street.
Yeah, ServiceNow shares closed down 12% yesterday, really in sympathy with the decline we saw, the sell-off we saw in Salesforce yesterday. Okay, from software to hardware, we got to talk about NVIDIA, because you've also written about that recently, and the S&P 500's reliance on NVIDIA reaching historic levels. Why is this an important metric for investors to keep an eye on, and to what extent is it a concern?
You're talking about its weight within the indexes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this has been such a huge driver, just overall market gains this year. It's such a major weight. And of course, if you did see some kind of reversal, and this really goes for all the Magnificent Seven, if you do see any kind of pullback there that does have broader implications, it does drag down a lot of names in sympathy. But the fact that, NVIDIA has been just so strong this year, just really just keeps pushing higher and higher, is certainly something that is it maybe overshadows some of the weakness that you see elsewhere in the markets. And, the strength of Microsoft, for example, might, kind of overshadow some of the weakness that you've seen elsewhere in software. So certainly when you have these major mega caps that are worth trillions of dollars, it certainly can help sweep some other stuff under the rug.
Well, how do you make sense in terms of some of the conversations you have on the markets, Ryan? Because I'm thinking, here we have NVIDIA alone accounted for more than 30% of total returns in the S&P 500 year to date. An incredible jump following its earnings. It's the highest among other comparable year-to-date S&P 500 rallies in 2023, 2021, and 2019. I mean, the superlatives around NVIDIA, just take your pick here. I'm looking on the Bloomberg, analyst ratings. 90% of the analysts that follow it have buys. So we've got 64 buy ratings, 7 holds, no sells on it. But I do wonder, what's the constructive conversation you have with folks around this? I know the fundamentals, it does seem, continue to support growth in NVIDIA, but what is it, how you approach it from its impact on the markets, and what you want to hear from folks who are watching the markets about the over impact, if you will, of NVIDIA on the S&P 500?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is that NVIDIA has been growing so quickly that the multiple is not as high as some people seem to be arguing out there. It's kind of growing, and estimates are kind of growing faster than the earnings in some cases. So the stock doesn't look like, the kind of extremes that we've seen in other periods of market excess or speculation. There's certainly people out there who think no stock can run this strong for this long and then not see some kind of consolidation that would probably be normal, if not even healthy. But certainly, people are very positive on its fundamentals, and the fact that you do have, pretty strong fundamentals and quality characteristics across so many of the mega caps in the stock market, which account for so much of the overall market weight. That certainly is, probably a stronger foundation than, the dot-com era or something like that, if you want to compare it to another period where tech was a real leader and things were a little bit more speculative than just based on sort of traditional valuation metrics.
All right, good stuff. Around the markets we go, and certainly when it comes to AI and all things related. Really appreciate it. Ryan, have a great weekend. Ryan Vostelica. He is Bloomberg News equities reporter joining us from our Chicago bureau. And we were just talking about the AI investment play. Coming up, we've talked about semis, obviously the impact when it comes to AI. It's happening against and perhaps because of the chip war. So we're going to get into that story when we come back here on Bloomberg Business Week. But thinking about NVIDIA, just going back there, it's up about 25% here in the month of May.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible rally, all based on the earnings that we got earlier this month. Just blew everything out of the water.
A massive jump. All right, folks, let's get to world and national news. For that, we head over to D.C. and our own Amy Morris. Amy.
Hi, Carol. President Biden spoke briefly about yesterday's verdict in the Trump trial and said the jury's decision should be respected. Anything less, he says, is dangerous.
And it's reckless. It's dangerous. It's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
President Biden clearly responding to the speech earlier today by Donald Trump, who continues to insist without evidence that the trial was unfair and the judge biased.
Now, I would have testified. I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify, because as soon as you testify, anybody, if it were George Washington, don't testify, because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong, and then they sue you for perjury.
Trump says he'll appeal. Sentencing is set for July 11th. And Trump's former lawyer and so-called fixer, the prosecution's star witness, Michael Cohen, told ABC's Good Morning America he wishes he had never met Trump.
As hard as it is on me watching my family suffer as a direct result of my actions and the misloyalty that I gave to Donald, it's something that haunts me every day.
Trump's guilty verdict seems to have rattled his donors as well. The Trump campaign says it has raised nearly $35 million in less than 24 hours after that verdict was announced. And Wall Street billionaires continue to back Trump despite the verdict. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.